In this video, we're going to discuss the first application we're going to build. The goal of this application is to practice your JavaScript skill set. We're not going to be covering a lot of new features of the language. Instead, we're going to be focusing on a lot of the stuff that we've already learned and really practicing our skill set. Let's take a look at some mock-ups to help you get an idea of what we're going to try to build. So we're going to be making an application called Movie Fight. The idea here is that a user is going to search for a movie on the left-hand side of the screen and a different one on the right-hand side of the screen. So a user is going to type in some movie title, and then once they search for it, we're going to fetch some information about that movie and show information about it on the left-hand side of the screen. So in this case, a user might have searched for Dark Knight, and so I would pull up some information about the movie The Dark Knight. This little box right here with an X represents the image or the movie poster for the Dark Knight movie. So we're going to show the poster for the movie right there, and then some stats about the movie underneath it. So for example, how much money it made, and its critical rating, and so on. Once a user searches for a movie on the left-hand side, they're then going to repeat that same process on the right-hand side. So we can imagine that a user might type in a different movie over here, like The Avengers, and we will show some information about the Avengers in a very similar fashion on the right-hand side. Now here's what makes this application an actual movie fight application. For every different stat that we fetch about every different movie, we're going to compare them between the two. Whichever movie has a higher statistic, we're going to highlight in green, and whichever movie has the lower statistic, we're going to show in yellow. So in this case, The Avengers made a lot more money at the box office than The Dark Knight. So we would color that statistic as green, and we would color the Dark Knight statistic as yellow. However, The Dark Knight might have a higher critic rating, so we'll show that as green, and the Avengers one will be displayed as yellow instead. So that's the application. There is one last thing I want to mention here, kind of a very specific thing, because we actually are going to be spending a pretty good amount of time on this. When a user searches for a movie, like in these two inputs right here, a user might not know exactly what movie they're looking for. They might have some kind of idea of what the title is, but they might only be able to remember that it has dark in the title if they are trying to find Dark Knight. So these two inputs right here are not going to be normal inputs. Instead, we're going to make them into kind of autocomplete inputs. So whenever a user types in something like just dark or even Dark Knight, we're going to have a little pop-up listing right here that shows a couple of different movies related to the search term that they just entered. So to actually select a movie and start the comparison, a user would have to click on that entry right there, and that would select the Dark Knight that was made in the year 2008. On the left-hand side of each of these movie titles, we're also going to show the poster for the movie as well. This is going to be a separate little autocomplete widget that we put together as a part of this project. We're going to build that autocomplete widget from scratch. And as a matter of fact, everything you see in this application is really going to be from scratch. So we're going to get a really good idea of how to approach this app, how to build it, and eventually we're going to deploy it. Okay, so I hope you're as excited as I am. This is going to be a really fun application. So let's take a quick pause right here and start working in the next video. Now that we have a better idea of what we're trying to build, let's get started working on this application. Before we write any code, however, I want to go through a couple of different steps here to make sure that we've got a really solid plan on how we're going to tackle this application. The first thing we're going to do is set up a little boilerplate for our project. So attached to this video, there is a zip file that has some starter files inside of it. If you haven't downloaded that zip file already, then pause the video and download the zip file right now. I've already downloaded that zip file and I've extracted its contents onto my computer. So inside of that zip file are three different files: the index.html file, a JavaScript file, and a CSS file. Once you get those files on your computer, make sure you also open them up inside of your code editor. So I've already done that right here. Here's the HTML file, the JavaScript file, and the CSS one. And then finally, make sure you open up the index.html file inside of your browser. Once you do so, you're going to see an initial screen like this right here. Okay, so once we've got that all set up, I want to very quickly just mention exactly what this term boilerplate is referring to. When we talk about a boilerplate package, we're talking about some essentially starter code for a project. Usually a boilerplate will have a little bit of setup already done inside of it, and usually it's going to have some code or HTML or styling that is generally kind of repetitive between different projects. So it's really just a good starter point to begin from. I know that sometimes using a starter package is kind of annoying and you might prefer to write out everything from scratch so you really understand what is going on. Just so you know, the only real setup that I've done inside of this little boilerplate package is, for the most part, just some styling. So just some CSS to make sure that the end product that we end up with is going to look really nice. This is a course about JavaScript and not CSS, and that's why I did all the CSS for you up front. You can, of course, review that CSS file at the end of this application and get a better idea of what's going on inside there if you want to. Okay, so now that we've got a little bit of setup done, let's take a pause right here and then identify some challenging aspects of this project in the next video. Whenever I start working on a new project, either a personal project or a professional one, I really like to sit down and identify some of the big problems that I anticipate that I'll run into as I'm working on that project. So I want to do that right now really quickly. We're going to identify some of the more challenging aspects of this application and get an idea on how to solve each one. I've already gone through and thought up some of the big kind of challenging things that we're probably going to have to wrestle with as we build this app. So we're going to talk about some of these big challenges and then go over some possible solutions to each of them as well. So the first thing we need to think about is where we're going to actually get some information about different movies. I want to show real data inside of this application. I don't want to just like make up movies or anything like that. There's probably two obvious ways that we could handle getting some information about movies into our application. The first obvious way, and this is probably not a good one, would be to write in or hard code some information about a bunch of different movies right into our JavaScript file. So we could create a really big array and write in some movies, like maybe the 100 most popular movies out there, directly into that array. That's not really a good solution, however, because it means that any time that we wanted to add in more movies, we would have to make a change to the source code of our application. In general, that's not really a good thing to do. So instead, I think that we should attempt to fetch some data about movies inside of our JavaScript code. When I say fetch, I mean let's make a network request to some outside API. So we should try to find some outside API, or essentially a server that will give our application a list of movies that we can search over or show details from. So for that, we're going to be making use of an API called the OMDB API. This is a free API that we can use to get information about different movies. I'm going to open up a new browser tab and navigate over there right away. Okay, so you can read over the documentation here. This API essentially exposes two different endpoints for us to use. If we scroll down a little bit, we can see parameters right here, and this will describe the different ways that we can access movie information. We can either search for movies, so that would be reading from this by search category right here, or alternatively, we can look up very specific movies if we know the ID or the title of a movie. So these two operations match up with our application really, really well. Just think about it for a second. If we go back over to our mockups over here, there's really two different operations that are going on around these movies inside of our application. The first distinct operation is when we do a search with the autocomplete. So when a user types in there, we need to essentially try to find movies that match a given search term. So that's really a searching operation. We want to find a big list of different movies that match that particular term. When a user finds the appropriate movie and clicks on it, we then want to fetch some additional information about that very particular movie right there. And then we're going to take that additional information and show it on the screen. So again, it's really a two-step operation. We first are going to do a search, and then we're going to do a very distinct lookup. Now, you might be curious why we have to do both a search and a lookup and not just a search by itself. In other words, if we're already doing a search for a bunch of movies and getting information about like 10 different movies as we are putting in results into that autocomplete, can't we just use that same data that we just fetched to put on the screen? Well, as a quick side note here, the way that a lot of APIs work is to give different sets of data depending upon whether you're doing a listing action or a show action, or trying to get information about one record. Let me tell you more about what I mean. So in this diagram, I've got some imaginary search results from two different operations on an API. On the left-hand side is the set of information that we might get back if we do a search or a listing, or what we refer to as an index operation. So this is what we would see if we tried to get a list of different movies. We might just get a very limited set of attributes about every movie, like just the ID of the movie and just the title. So when we do an index or a search operation, we very frequently don't get the full listing of information about every individual record. Instead, if we want to get the full listing and we want to understand every attribute that a movie has, we usually end up having to do a follow-up request where we say, hey, give me some details about the movie with ID number 1. And then the API will probably respond with a full set of attributes, essentially everything that it knows about that particular movie. A very easy way to understand this is to just think about Google search results. When you do a Google search, you don't see an entire web page. Instead, Google just shows you some high-level attributes of every web page that it finds that matches your query. If you want to actually get some details about any given web page, you actually have to click it. And so that would be like a selection or a show operation. So it's going to be the exact same thing with the API we are using. We're going to have to do initially a search to find some records that match the user's search term, and then a follow-up request to get information about the very particular movie that a user selected. Okay, so that's big challenge number 1. Don't worry, the other challenges are a little bit easier to understand. So the second big thing that we're going to have to do is to build an autocomplete widget from scratch. There's definitely some pre-completed or pre-built widgets out there online that we could download and use inside of our code. However, it would be a really good learning opportunity to put together our own autocomplete. So I think we should do that inside of our project. Now, I don't really have a lot to say about this challenge until we really start tackling it and writing code, but I think that at least at a minimum, you and I should really sit down and really agree on how an autocomplete widget works in general. If we just tried to write out some autocomplete logic right away, well, you and I might have really different ideas about how an autocomplete works. And even like you personally, you might have some idea about how an autocomplete works, and then you might start writing some code and then realize that the code you're writing doesn't really match up with what you thought personally about an autocomplete. So in other words, I think that we really just need to sit down and say, this is how an autocomplete widget works. So we're going to do that in a separate video. Okay, last thing here, the app would definitely look a lot better with styling and CSS. Like I mentioned, the starter kit that we're using has a little bit of CSS written into it, and it also makes use of a CSS framework called Bulma CSS. So this is stuff that has already been wired up for you. We're going to have a quick discussion or two about CSS as it pertains to this application. In particular, we're going to take a little look at Bulma CSS just really as a side topic. Again, this is a course about JavaScript. Nonetheless, you might be curious about it, so we'll do a little quick aside just to understand what's happening with this thing. Okay, so that's it. That's our big challenges. So let's take a pause right here. Now that we have a better idea of what we're trying to build, we've identified some of the hard things about this project, we're going to get started writing code in the next video. So quick pause and I'll see you in just a minute. All right, my friends, in this video we're going to start writing some code. The first thing we're going to do is to make sure that we can reach out to the OMDB API and do a search for some different movies. That's a very core operation inside of our app, so we should probably make sure that we can get that working right away. To make use of this free API, I'm going to first navigate to omdbapi.com inside my browser. Once here, we first have to sign up for the API and get what is called an API key. The API key essentially identifies us to the API whenever we make a request. We can think of it as like an email and password that our code is sending over to the API. To get an API key, we're going to go up to the very top menu and find the section that says API key. It is free to generate an API key. All we have to do is enter in our email address. So I'm going to select the free option right here. And then I will enter in my email. It does have to be a valid email because they're going to email us our key. So I'll put in my email, my name, and for use right here, we're just being asked to enter a description of what we are building. So I'm just going to say that this is API practice. Doesn't really matter what we put in there. I'll then submit this, and then I'll be told that, there we go, I'm going to be sent a verification link to my email. So you're going to now open up your email account, and you're going to find an email that was just sent to you. So I'm going to pull up my email really quickly. Here it is right here. You'll see that I am given my API key. That is essentially my password right there, and it identifies me to the API. Before we can use that key, we do have to click the link at the bottom of the email. So make sure that you do click that link right there. Now I'm told that my key has been activated. Okay, very good. So make sure you keep that key up on your screen. We're going to use it in just a moment. Before we use the key, however, let's take another look at the documentation for this API and get a better idea of how we do a search operation. So I'm going to go back to the main page and then scroll down a little bit. So to access the API, we're going to make a request to that URL right there. When we make the request, we have to include the API key that we just signed up with. In order to customize the request, we're going to also pass in some number of different query string parameters. Remember, parameters are essentially added on to the very end of a URL. We're going to be using a library that is going to add in these different parameters for us automatically. So to do a search operation, we'll scroll down to the search section, and we are being told right here that if we add in a query string parameter called s and assign it some string, that is going to be interpreted as the movie title that we are trying to search for. So this documentation is not the most clear in the world, but that's okay. Well, let's go back over to our code editor, and we're going to start to write out some code to make a search request, and this documentation will very quickly start to make sense. Okay, so back inside of my code editor, I've already opened up my index.js file. So I'm going to delete that console log that was inside there by default. We're going to be making a network request here. Remember that with JavaScript, there are many different ways that we can make a network request. We can use the built-in fetch function that is included inside the browser, or we can make use of third-party libraries like the Axios library. That makes making requests just a little bit easier. In this case, we're going to be using Axios, again, just because it makes our life a little bit easier than using fetch directly. Axios has already been wired up to this project. You can find it referenced in a script tag inside of the index.html file. So in order to make our request, I'm going to first define a helper function that I'm going to call fetch data. I'm going to want to use the async await syntax with this thing when we make our request. So I'm going to mark the function as async. And then inside the function body, I will write out const response is await axios.get. So remember, the first argument to the axios.get function is going to be the URL that we want to retrieve. Whenever we make a network request, that is an asynchronous operation, and we essentially have to wait before we get some kind of response to continue running the lines of code directly underneath that. And that's why we have the await keyword right there. We're going to eventually get back a response object. That is an object that represents all the information related to this request and response that we just made. And inside of that response object is the data that we should be getting back from our API. So as the first argument to axios.get, I'm going to go back over to the API documentation. I'm going to find where it says usage, and I'm going to put in this URL right here. Now, really important, we're not going to copy in the API key part just yet. So I'm just going to get http omdbapi.com. So I'm just going to copy that and then put it in as the first argument. So again, make sure you only have .com inside there like so. Then to specify all the different parameters here, like our API key or the search string that we want to use, we're going to use some automated functionality inside of Axios. So we could manually type out $API key, blah, blah, blah right there, but instead, using Axios, we can write this out a lot more neatly by putting in a second argument of an object. Inside this second argument, we're going to put in a property called params. And inside this thing, we're going to list out all the different query string parameters that we want to pass along with the request. So we can imagine that this object right here is going to be turned into a string and appended to the end of that URL. Inside of params, we're going to first list out our API key. Now, really important, notice that we have a lowercase key on here. It is not uppercase, so everything is lowercase. And then I'm going to put in the API key that I just got from my email a moment ago. So here's the API key right there. I'm going to copy it and paste it in. Then I'm also going to specify that S property. S essentially stands for search. That is the property we just looked up on the API documentation. So this is going to be a string of the movie that we want to search for. I'm going to first try looking for the Avengers. So I'll put in Avengers like so. Okay, and that should be it. That should be all we need to make our request. Now, if this params object right here is a little bit mysterious, don't sweat it. As soon as we make the request and look at it inside of our browser, you're going to very quickly understand what that part is all about. Okay, so after we make the request, I'll then do a console.log of response.data. Again, remember that whenever we make a request with Axios, this is an object that has a lot of different properties inside of it that describe the request and response we just issued. The only property that we usually care about is the data property, and that's the actual information that we just got back from that API. All right, so I'll save this. One last thing. Let's make sure we call fetch data at the bottom. So I'm going to save this now, flip back over to the browser. I'm going to go back to my index.html page. I'm going to open up my console and then refresh. And sure enough, right away, I see a response from that API. Now, if you do not see a response right here, if you instead see some kind of error message, make sure, first off, that you have, in fact, activated your API key so that you went into your email and clicked on that link. Secondly, make sure that you've got a lowercase API key right here. Make sure that you've got the correct URL right there, and essentially just do a direct comparison of this file. So inside of this response object that we got back, we have a search property. And inside there are all the different movies that match the search string that we just provided. So I'm seeing a lot of different movies with the word Avengers in the title. One thing I want to point out here is that you'll notice that we are just getting back a couple of different properties about each movie. So I'm only seeing the title, the type, whether it is a movie, a TV show, or something similar, the year that it was released, the ID of the movie, and then very interestingly right here, a link to the image for the movie as well. If I copy that and throw it into my browser really quickly, I'll see the poster. So this is what we're going to eventually show for each individual movie. Now, one last thing I want to show you, inside of my network request log, if I open that up, I can search by XHR requests, and this will show me only the requests that my JavaScript code have issued. So there's the request that we just made to the API. If I click on headers right here, it will show me the full request URL. So you'll notice that Axios took that params object that we passed in to that configuration object. It took the API key property and its value, and the S property and its value, and it stuck them automatically into the URL as a query string. So again, this is what is kind of nice about using Axios. If we were using fetch, we would have had to form that string by ourselves by hand. Not the worst thing in the world, but again, just a nice little benefit to using the Axios library. Okay, so now we've got some data. I know this is a long video. Don't worry, future videos will definitely be shorter for the most part. So let's take a pause right here, and we're going to start to investigate our data that we just fetched a little bit more. I'm taking a look at the search results that we just got back from the OMDB API. Inside of here, I'm looking at the very first result, and I'm noticing that we've got just a couple of different properties that represent this first search result. One thing that's kind of interesting is that I don't see any information related to a lot of the stuff that we need to actually make this application work correctly. So for example, we want to make sure that we eventually show a short summary of the movie and the box office take, the critic rating, and so on. But none of that information is visible inside of this search result right here. Well, this goes back to a discussion that we had just 2 videos ago. Usually, whenever we make use of an API like this one, we got a one endpoint for doing a searching or index operation. And we are just seeing a very limited set of information about every search result that we just got. So if we now want to get more information about a very particular movie and get like the revenue or the rating or whatever else, we have to do a follow-up request. So this would be referred to as a show action or a show request or something similar. When we do this show request, we should hopefully be able to get a lot more information about one particular movie at a time. So let's take another look at the OMDB API documentation and figure out how we can do a request like the one over here on the right-hand side and get all that extra information that we know that our app is going to need. So I'm going to once again go back to the documentation. We were looking at by search previously. This time I'm going to go up to by ID or title. So if we do a lookup for a single movie at a time, which is essentially this section right here, we're going to get a bunch of information about just one particular movie. To do this request, we're going to add in a new parameter called simply I, lowercase I. That is going to be the ID of a movie that we've already found through our search request. So to do this request right here, we're going to go back over to our code. I'm no longer going to pass in that S string anymore. That was if we wanted to do a search operation. I now instead want to do a lookup operation. So I'm going to put in I, like so, and then I have to put in the ID of the movie that I want to look up. To get the ID of a movie, I'm going to go back to the search results that I was just looking at inside of my browser. It looks like the ID of the movie The Avengers is TT08 blah 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 right there. So I'm going to copy that string and then paste it in as I, like so. So we no longer have an S, instead we just have an I that indicates the exact movie that we want to get information about. So I'll now save this. I'm going to go back over to my browser once again, refresh, and now I get information about just this single movie. And inside of here is way more information than what we got before. And inside of here is definitely all the information that we really need to make our application work. So remember, we need to eventually get the search string, or synopsis right here. We need to get the box office value and the critic ratings and so on. And so inside of this result, we can see plot right here. That is the kind of plot summary of the movie. We can see the box office take right there. So that's the amount of money the movie made. And I can also see a rating right there. So that's essentially the critic rating. There's also a Metascore right here, which is another critic rating as well. So again, this is the request that we're going to have to do once a user selects on an individual movie or clicks an individual movie, and we want to show a lot of information about that single movie on the screen. Okay, so now that we understand the two different types of requests we have to make, let's take another pause right here, and we're going to start working on our UI in the next video. We've now got a good understanding of how to make requests to that outside API and get some information about some different movies. So we're now going to turn our focus a little bit and start to think about how we're going to put together that autocomplete widget. Once we understand the autocomplete, we'll then be able to just about go straight from start to finish on writing out the code for this project. So just one last little video here. I put together a diagram on the behavior of this autocomplete widget. This is a kind of confusing diagram, so we're going to go through it step by step. But my intent here is to really clarify exactly how this autocomplete widget is going to work. Once again, I really recommend that on your own personal projects, you go through a kind of process like what I'm about to show you to make sure that you personally are 100% aware about the requirements of the different things that you need to build inside of your application. Once you start building diagrams like this, or you don't even have to make a diagram, just to be clear, once you just start thinking through it, I can just about guarantee that you're going to very quickly start to realize there are corner cases that are a lot easier to solve up front, as opposed to if you were just start to write code and then kind of run into some issue along the way. Okay, so we're going to start off this diagram on the very top left-hand side, and we're going to think about all the different ways that a user can interact with this widget. So this is what the widget is going to look like when a user first loads up the page. We're going to show them just a simple empty input. We would refer to this as the default state. In other words, this is what it looks like by default when the application first starts up. At some point in time, the user is then going to start typing inside that input. As soon as the user enters in some kind of full string and stops typing, we're going to take that search string and make a request off to the API. We're going to do a search request, get back some list of results like we just saw a moment ago. We're going to take all those search results, open up a little menu underneath that input, and render out all the possible movies that the user might have been looking for. As a quick reminder, these boxes with an X in them represent an image. So that would be the movie poster for the movie The Dark Knight, made in 2012. Right away, there is one other case we need to be aware of here. It is entirely possible that a user will enter in a search string, will do a search, and not find any results whatsoever. So if we don't find any results, we're just going to say that we're going to close that menu entirely. It might be a little bit better to show some kind of error message to the user and tell them, hey, sorry, but we couldn't find any movies with that search term. But for right now, we're not going to worry about that right away. So we're going to say if we don't find any results, just hide the menu. Okay, so that's kind of like step one, understanding what happens in the instant that the user starts to type stuff in. So now I want to kind of go further along the flow and think about the different ways that a user can then interact with the widget after we show them that menu. The first thing they could do is press enter, thinking that that will select some kind of record or something like that. In this case, we're going to require a user to actually click on an element here to select it. So we want to see a user click on like that movie or that movie or that movie to indicate which one they want to select. So we're going to require them to click on a movie, and pressing the enter key is not going to do anything. This is another one of those scenarios where you kind of have to sit down and think these things through, because otherwise you might build the widget and then press the enter key expecting something to happen and see that it does nothing and be kind of surprised. So I'm saying from the get-go that I don't want anything to happen if a user presses the enter key. The next possible interaction is that a user does what we want. They might click on an entry. So if they click on an entry, that means that they have made their selection. In that case, we're going to update the text inside of the input to the exact text of the title of the movie that they just clicked on. So for example, if the user had searched for Dark Knight, and then they clicked on The Dark Knight with proper capitalization, we're going to take that full movie title right there, just the title, not the year it was made. We're just showing the year for convenience sake for the user. We're going to take that full title and stick it back into the input so that it's crystal clear exactly what movie they're looking at. Now there's one last possible way of interacting with this thing that we need to be aware of after a user enters a search term. If they enter a term and we open up that drop-down menu and show them all the options, they might decide that they don't want to pick any movie. They might decide, yeah, I'm kind of done with this. I don't want to select a movie. I want to work on some other part of this application or something. If that's the case and they click outside of the menu after it's been opened, then we're going to make sure that we close the menu and do nothing else. So this is one more of those scenarios where we really have to think through the life cycle of the entire widget, and it's helpful to do so before we start writing any code. Okay, so that's it. That's the entire life cycle of this little autocomplete. These are all the different scenarios that we really have to be thinking about. Now there definitely are one or two kind of other corner cases inside of this widget that we need to be aware of that I kind of purposely did not add into this diagram, because I want us to kind of run into these little mysterious scenarios and point them out as kind of a learning experience. So we might see one or two unexpected things crop up along the way. All right, now that we understand what we're trying to do here and we understand the interaction with this widget, let's take one more pause and then start writing some code in the next video. Well, I think that we both understand exactly how this autocomplete widget is going to work in general, at least how we're going to interact with it. So let's start writing out some code. The first thing we're going to do, or the first step, is to just show a plain text input to the user. Anytime a user types inside there, we're going to initiate a search of our API and try to find some corresponding list of movies. So to get started, I'm going to go back over to my code editor and find my index.html file. At the very bottom, I'm going to find a div inside of here with a class of container. You and I are going to add all of our HTML inside of this div. The other HTML that you see right above it is responsible for just showing the header, and we're not going to have to mess with any of that stuff at all for this entire application. So inside of that container, I'm going to add in an input element. Okay, so that's pretty much it. That's all the HTML we have to add for right now. So I'll then go back over to the index.js file. And inside of here, we'll add in a little bit of code to select that input element. Then we'll add in an event listener. And we'll say that anytime a user types inside there, we're going to run our fetch data function and try to search for some particular movie. So at the very bottom of the file, I'm going to delete the fetch data function call because we no longer want to search the API automatically when our application first starts. I'll then select my input and assign it to an input variable. So I'll say document.querySelector input, like so. Then I'll add on my event listener. So I'll do an input.add event listener, and we're going to watch for the input event. The input event is triggered anytime that a user changes the text inside that input, and that's exactly what we want. Then as a second argument, I'll put in my callback function that's going to be called with some event object. So now remember, we can get access to the change text by referencing event.target.value. That's going to be whatever the user just typed into that input. So now if we want to try to search the API, we can take that variable right there and pass it as an argument into fetch data. We can then do a little bit of work on fetch data to make sure that it receives an argument and uses that as the query string or as the query for a search of the API. So inside of my event listener, I'm going to call fetch data, with the value from the input. I'll then make sure that I receive that as an argument to this function. So I'll call that, how about search term, like so. And then we will make sure that we pass that in as a param. Now right now, remember that we refactored this params object to look up details about a very specific movie. If we want to look up a collection of different movies or do an actual search, then instead of an S param right there, or something that I param, we will replace it with an S. And that's just straight from the documentation that we were looking at. We can go back over really quickly if you want to and look at the search documentation. If we want to do a search, we're going to add in an S parameter. So then instead of searching for that very particular movie ID, we'll instead search for search term. And that should be it. So let's save this file. I'll go back over. I'm going to refresh the page. I see my search input. I'm also going to open up the network tab inside of my Chrome console so that I can see all the different requests that we're making to the API. If I want to see only the requests that our JavaScript code are issuing, we can click on the XHR button right here, and that's going to filter by just requests that are being created from our JavaScript code. I'll then start to type inside of here, and we'll see what happens. So I'm going to search for Avengers. Avengers, like so. Okay, as soon as I started typing, I saw a collection of different requests being issued. If I go to the very last request that was made, I can click on it. I'll see the query string right there inside the URL says S equals Avengers. All right, that's definitely good. And if I click on preview, I'll see that I definitely get some search results for the Avengers movie. Perfect. Well, it definitely looks like it's working out pretty well so far, but there's just one little issue. We're doing a search of the API for every single key press. Is that a problem? I would say yes. This is not really ideal. The reason this is not ideal is that you and I only get to access the API 1,000 times per day. So we've got a hard cap on the number of times we can reach out. To search for the Avengers, I made a total of like 12 requests or so. I even made a little typo in there, which means I had to make an additional 3 requests or so as I fixed the typo. So I just ate up 12 out of my 1,000 possible requests that I get to make for the entire day with that one single query. So what would be kind of nice is if we said, okay, as soon as the user stops typing for a little bit of time, then let's go ahead and do the search automatically. So in other words, if I type out Avengers and then just sit here for like half a second and don't type anything more, let's make our request then, as opposed to doing a request for every single key press. That's going to be a little bit of complicated logic. Let's take a quick pause right here and figure out how we will implement that in the next video. In the last video, we saw that we were making search requests to our API way too often. So in this video, we're going to figure out how to somehow fix this behavior. Just to make sure it's really crystal clear what we're going to try to do, let me show you a couple of quick diagrams. So this is our current behavior. Right now, every single time there's a key press, we do a search to our API. And this is not ideal. This is not what we want. So instead, this is a little bit closer to the experience that we want to have inside of our application. We want to allow the user to press the key inside that input as many times as they want. And only after we go through about 1 second or so of nothing happening do we want to eventually call the search function. So in other words, let the user press as many times as they want. If they then stop for 1 second, then go ahead and call search. And there's 2 ways that we can implement this functionality. We can either add in a JavaScript library that will do this for us automatically, or we can write out some code where we will just figure out how to do it ourselves. And I bet you can guess which we're going to do. We're going to figure out how to implement this from scratch on our own. It's actually a little bit simpler than you might think. But to implement this, we first need to get a little bit of background on the setTimeout function. Chances are you've already taken a look at the setTimeout function in JavaScript before, but I just want to give you a quick recap on how setTimeout works in general. So I'm going to write out a little bit of test code inside my console back over here. So inside my console, inside my browser, I'm going to use the setTimeout function. I can use it by calling setTimeout. I'm going to pass in an arrow function to it as the first argument. And inside of that arrow function, I'll do a console log of hi there, like so. The second argument to the setTimeout function is a delay that's going to specify how long we want to wait before we run that function right there, the one with console log. So as the second argument to setTimeout, I'm going to put in 1,000, which means that I want to wait 1 second or 1,000 milliseconds before executing that function. So if I run that, I'll wait for about a second, and then I see hi there appear. I can adjust it up to 5 seconds, and now we'll wait 5 seconds before that function is invoked. Now the important thing to keep in mind around setTimeout is that anytime we call it, we get back an integer value. So in the first case, we got out of setTimeout a value of 1. In the next case, we got out a value of 2. These numbers are essentially identifiers, and they identify the timer that we just created. If we want to, we can call the clearTimeout function to stop that pending timer and prevent that function from being called. So I'm going to set up another timeout, and I'm going to give it a timeout of 10 seconds, like so. That's going to give me more than enough time to write out some code very quickly to clear the timer that I set up with this line of code. So I'm going to run that and then very quickly write out clear timeout with 3 like so. When I call clear timeout of 3, that means look at the timer that was created with the ID of 3. So the timer that was created with an ID of 3 was this one right here. So I'm saying stop that running timer and don't call that function ever, even after 10 seconds pass. So that's just a quick reminder on how setTimeout and clearTimeout work. Now that we understand or have a quick reminder on that, let's go back over to our code, and we're going to add in a little bit of code to add in this behavior right here. Okay, so back inside my index.js file, I'm going to go down to where we added that event listener. So the function that we kind of want to prevent from being executed is this whole function right here. We want to stop that from ever running if a user is pressing on the keyboard too often. So to add that in, I'm going to first assign that function to a new variable. I'm going to cut the function out. Right above, I'm going to create a new variable called onInput and assign that function to it. I'll then pass that variable as the second argument into the event listener. So onInput like so. So what we have right here is 100% equivalent to the code we had before. Now we can add in some logic to actually make sure that we don't call input too often. So to do so, inside of onInput, I'm going to first, right above the function, declare a variable that I'll call timeout ID, like so. We're eventually going to take one of those IDs, so we get from calling setTimeout, like the ones we saw back over here, 1, 2, and 3, and we're going to assign one of those IDs to this variable. Then inside this function, we're going to wrap the fetch data call with a setTimeout. So I'll say setTimeout like so. I'll move my call to fetch data into the timeout function. Then as the second argument to setTimeout, I'm going to put in 1000 milliseconds. So if we ran our code right now, the only effect would be to make sure that we introduce a delay of 1000 milliseconds between typing something and actually calling fetch data. That's the only change that would occur right now. But we want to make sure that we don't run any code until the user stops typing for some amount of time. So to implement that behavior, I'm going to take the timer that gets returned from calling setTimeout and assign it to timeout ID like so. Now here's the magic line of code. Right above that, so between onInput and where we assign that timeout ID, I'm going to add in an if statement. I'm going to say if timeout ID, then clear timeout ID. That's the magic part right there. Now you can kind of imagine what is going on behind the scenes here. We're going to be calling onInput many, many times in a row. Just imagine a user typing into the input like the word Avengers. However many characters that is, we're going to call onInput that number of times. The very first time that onInput is going to be called, we're going to enter this function. We're going to take a look and see if timeout ID is defined. The very first time that we call this function, timeout ID is going to be undefined. So we're going to skip over this if statement entirely. We're going to go down to setTimeout and set up a timer and say in 1 second, call fetch data. So that's the very first key press. We're then going to assign that timer to timeout ID. The user is then going to press on the second key on their keyboard. The second time they press the key, we're going to once again enter this function. And now when we hit the if statement, timeout ID will be defined. So we're going to enter the if statement and we're going to stop that pending timer. So we're going to stop the existing one and we're going to set up a brand new one. But the brand new one is going to have a new value that it's going to call fetch data with. That process is then going to repeat itself over and over and over again until we eventually go for a full second before calling on input again. In that scenario, we're not going to call clear timeout. This timeout is going to execute and fetch data will be called. So let's save this and test out our code and see how it's doing. I'm going to go back over to the network tab. Over here, I'm going to search for Avengers again. So I'll put in Avengers like so. And I have to wait for about a second after my last key press before I actually see a request being issued, which is exactly what we want. So now a user can be typing in here, they can make as many typos as they want, and we're not burning through all of our credits on our API. That looks pretty good. So now the last thing I want to mention is that we can very easily make sure that we execute the search a little bit more quickly by just adjusting that 1000 milliseconds right there. So we can instead go to 500, and now we are going to do the search twice as quickly after the user stops typing. So now I can put in Avengers, and I'll see the search appear right away. Okay, so this looks pretty good. Let's take a quick pause right here and continue in the next video. In the last video, we added in some code to make sure that we only call our search function after the user stops pressing on their key inside that input for about 1 second or so. This entire process right here is referred to as debouncing an input. So this is when we are going to wait for some amount of time to pass after this last event before we actually run some function. There's actually many different scenarios in which we might want to debounce some event inside of a web application, not just for text inputs. So there might be some other scenarios that we want to limit how often we call it in order for performance reasons, exactly like what we just did for our API. Because of that, I think that it might be useful to think of some way to refactor the code that we just wrote right here and make it more reusable in nature. Because like I just said, it might turn out that we have to debounce other things inside of our application at some future point in time. And I don't know about you, but this code right here is kind of hard to read and hard to understand. So it would be nice to make this more reusable and kind of hide the complexity or hide the implementation of the actual debouncing logic. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to refactor this into some more reusable fashion so we don't have to think about these like really complicated set timeout and clear timeout calls and whatnot. Now, before we start to write this code, I want to show you a diagram to just help you understand how this refactor is going to work, because it is going to be slightly complicated. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Right now, we are essentially trying to debounce the onInput event, or the onInput function. We're saying that we don't want to receive any notifications of a change to that input until after some amount of time occurs. So we kind of want to guard access to the onInput function. So to make that happen, we're going to create a new helper function called the debounce function. This debounce function is going to be a little bit complicated for exactly one reason. We're going to pass a callback or a function into this debounce function. The thing that makes it complicated is that the debounce function itself is going to return a function as well. That's what is complicated in my opinion. Maybe that's really easy to understand, but I think it's kind of hard to grasp the very first time you see it. Now, like I said, we're going to pass a function into the debounce function. That is something that is probably not going to be a big shock to you. Throughout this course, we've seen several times already where we pass callback functions to other functions. And heck, we're already doing it back over here. We are passing a function into add event listener so that onInput can be called at some point in time in the future when the user inputs something into our text input. So that part, passing a function into another function, not that bad. The only hard part to understand here is understanding that debounce is going to return a new function. So this green box right here represents a new function. It's like a wrapper of sorts that's going to restrict calls to the original onInput. So this onInput right here is the same function as that one. So again, this green box, it just restricts access to onInput. It might be better to visualize this using a slightly different diagram. So in this diagram, we still have the green box that represents kind of like a wrapper function of sorts that restricts access. So you can imagine that the green function, this wrapper, kind of has like a shield of sorts, and it's going to guard against repetitive, instantaneous calls to onInput. So if we start to call onInput very quickly several times in a row, this shield is going to step in and say, sorry, you can't get through. You have to wait some amount of time before I'm actually going to execute your call. So we can imagine that maybe 1 second passes and we end up like down here. And at that point in time, the shield is going to say, Okay, you know what? Most recent call to on input, I'm going to actually let you through because 1 second did pass and you were the last person to call this, so I'm going to let you through. So again, we can imagine the green function right here as being like that little shield that's going to deflect all those other calls. So that's the idea. So let's take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next video, we're going to refactor our code and build out this debounce helper function. In this video, we're going to define our debounce helper function. So right above the timeout ID, I'm going to make a new function called debounce. Like we just discussed, this thing is going to take an argument of a function. I'm going to refer to that as an argument called func, short for function. We could just as easily call it CB for callback or just callback itself, but I'm going to call it func. So then inside of here, we're going to return a function like so. So this function right here, that is the wrapper. That is the thing that is going to implement a little shield and guard how often func can actually be invoked. So what you have right here, this is kind of the hardest part to understand. All we have to do now to finish up the implementation of debounce is essentially take all the same code that we have down here and stick it into debounce. So let's go through that step by step. The first thing we're going to do, just above the return statement, is define let timeout ID. Then inside of our function, so this is the function that we are going to be calling possibly many times in a row, we're going to first check to see if timeout ID is defined. And if it is, we're going to clear that timeout. We're going to say, sorry, previous execution, turns out you're not going to be actually running. So we're going to stop that thing in its tracks. Then immediately after that, we're going to queue up a new execution of our underlying function, which we can do by calling setTimeout, passing it the function to run. Inside there, we will call func like so. And then as a second argument to setTimeout, we'll put in the delay that we want to have. And then we're going to make sure that when we call setTimeout, we take the timer that gets returned and assign it back to timeout ID. Like so. And that's pretty much it. There's just one last thing we have to take care of. This function right here that we pass in might need to receive some kind of arguments. So we essentially need to make sure that if we ever pass any arguments to this green wrapping function that we intend to get over to on input, we essentially have to take the arguments that are being passed to the green function and forward them on to on input. So to do so, very simply, like a real straightforward way of doing it would be to say, okay, I'm going to take in that first argument right there that I'll call simply ARG, short for argument. I'm going to take whatever that argument is, and I'm going to pass it through to that func when it finally actually gets called, like so. So that's a very simple and straightforward way of doing that. However, this approach right here will only work if we are passing in one single argument, and that's possibly not always the case. So to make sure that this works in all cases, we're going to use a little bit more fancier code. We're going to say ... args, plural. So this is going to take all the different arguments that are passed to the function. Then down here, when we call func, we're going to do func.apply with null and args. Remember what the apply function does. It essentially says, call the function as we normally would, and take all the arguments or whatever is inside of that array right there and pass them in as separate arguments to the original function. So this right here, like the code that you see right here, is 100% equivalent to if we had instead, I'm going to make a very quick change here, like arg1, arg2, arg3, and then inside of here called func with arg1, arg2, arg3. 100% equivalent. The only difference is that the apply way is going to automatically keep track of however many arguments we need to actually pass through. Only difference. Okay, so I'm going to go back to that point right there. Okay, so that is the entire debounce function. So now we can use this anywhere inside of our code, anytime that we need to introduce some rate limiting, essentially, on how often a function can be invoked. So in this case, we want to limit how often on input gets invoked. So let's take out all the timeout code that we have inside of here right now, and we're going to instead use our debounce function on it. So I'll first begin by deleting timeout ID. I'm going to delete the if statement. I'm going to delete the timeout ID with setTimeout and the closing brackets on there, and then fix up the indentation a little bit. And now we're back to a very simple, plain, and easy to read on input function. So now we can apply the debounce function right on this thing right here. So we can say, I want to pass in that function like so. So now we can imagine that this thing right here is going to be received into debounce as func. And we're going to rate limit it essentially on how often it can be invoked. We're going to wait until some amount of time has passed before we actually invoke it. And then the important thing to keep in mind here is that we are returning a new function. So we can take whatever gets returned from debounce and still continue to assign it to onInput. Now we just have a version of onInput that can only actually be invoked once every second. So we can still continue to pass that directly on through to our event listener like we were doing before. Just so you know, there's one other way that we could have applied debounce. We could have defined onInput normally like we did before, and instead apply debounce when we pass it off to the event listener. So we could have used debounce down here as well. 100% equivalent, same exact thing. It's just a question of where we are actually applying the debounce logic. We would want to apply it in this way, like when we actually use the function or pass it off somewhere else. If we expected to call onInput multiple different times from multiple different places, and we only wanted to debounce it in some scenarios. Okay, so let's save this and go do a quick test. So I'll flip back over. I'm going to search for Avengers. I'll wait for a second, and then I see the response appear. So it looks like it's still working as expected. Okay, so one last little improvement we could add inside of here. At present, we've got a hard-coded delay of 1 second. And chances are we would want to allow other developers who might be using this function to adjust that more easily. So an easy way to do that would be to say that we're going to take in a second argument to our debounce function. That second argument might be called something like delay, and that will be the number of milliseconds that we want to wait. So I can use that delay argument in place of 1000 right there. And now whenever I make use of debounce, I would just have to make sure that I pass in the number of milliseconds to wait. Like in this case, maybe just half a second like we had before. So that would definitely work. One last very small optimization as well. We could say that maybe we just want to have like a default delay amount. And to do so, we can use a defaulted argument right up here. So we could say something like equals 1000. So now that means that if we ever make use of debounce without passing in that second argument, we're going to get a default delay value of 1000 milliseconds. But I'm going to go with 500 because I felt like that was pretty responsive when we tested it out inside the browser. Okay, let's save that. One last quick test here. I'll search for Avengers, and looks like we're good to go. Okay, so that's it. That is the debounce function from scratch. Now I want to save really quickly here. If this is really confusing, and chances are it is, don't sweat it. Honestly, if you're going through this course right now and you're having a hard time with this function, I honestly really expect you to have a hard time with this. I really, really do expect this to be some challenging stuff. The reason I'm showing it to you is that seeing hard code like this is how you get to be a better engineer. If I just continue to show you a bunch of like baby easy code that's really easy to understand, you're never going to be a better engineer. You have to look at the harder stuff like this. It is what is going to make you into a better engineer. So if it is hard, good. That is a good thing. You want it to be hard. If it's easy, hey, congratulations. You understand what's going on. So either way, don't feel bad if this is some hard stuff to understand. I really, really do expect it to be challenging. Okay, so this all looks great. We've got a great working debounce function. So let's take a pause right here and continue working on our app in the next video. Our debounce function is all done, but there's one last very quick thing I want to do with it. Our index.js file is already getting a pretty good amount of code inside of it. Right now we're at just 29 lines of code and we've barely really begun to start our application. So I think that we could be well served to move this debounce function out into a separate file. Inside of my root project directory, I'm going to make a new file called utils.js. The idea behind this file is that I'm going to place any utility functions that I create inside of here. So this is just so I can better organize the code inside of my project. I'm going to go find the debounce function. I'm going to cut it, move it over to utils.js, and paste it. I then need to make sure that I include the utils.js file inside of my HTML document. So I'm going to open up the HTML document. I'm going to go down to the very bottom of the file. I'll find the existing script tag for index.js, and I'm going to copy it and paste it right underneath itself. I'll then find the first script tag and change the source to utils.js. So now whenever we load up this HTML document, I'm going to first load up and execute all the code inside of utils.js. That will define the debounce function. We'll then load up and execute index.js, which has a reference to debounce. So we need to make sure that we define utils first, or include that file first, so that we can define the debounce function before we run it inside of index.js. Okay, so let's save all these files. I'm going to make sure all 3 are saved. I'll then go back over to my browser, do a quick refresh. I'll search for Avengers again, and I'm just going to make sure that I still see my data getting fetched. And yep, I definitely do. Okay, quick little change, all good to go. Let's take another quick pause and continue with our app in the next video. Let's continue working on our autocomplete input. At this point, we are calling fetch data inside of the onInput function. Let's make sure that we return some usable data from fetch data. Once we get some usable data back, we'll then make sure that we iterate over it, and for every movie we fetch, we'll try to render out some content onto the screen. After that, we'll then start to think about how we can select a video by actually clicking on it. So to make sure that we actually get some data back from fetch data, let's take a look at the fetch data implementation. Here it is right here. Right now, at the very end of the function, we're just console logging out our data, which is not very useful. Instead, we should probably return all the data that we have fetched. But more importantly, we need to make sure that we only return the actual real data that we care about. Let me show you what I mean by that. If I go back over to my browser right now and do another search, I'm going to see a console log of all the data that we get back inside of our request. So this is the console.data property. It is an object that has a search property inside of it that is an array of objects. So you and I don't really care about the response property. We don't really care about total results. All you and I really care about is the search property. So from fetch data, we should really only be returning the search property and nothing else. So I'm going to go back over. I'm going to find fetch data. I'm going to remove that console log, and I will replace it with return response.data.search. Now notice that I'm using a capital S right here. That is definitely not standard. Usually in JavaScript, we always have every variable preceding with a lowercase letter, like so. The only reason I'm using an uppercase S right here is that the response that we actually get back from this API has a capital S in it. And that's actually true with many of the different properties that we're going to see coming back from the API. This is very much non-standard in nature. So it is way more standard on any API to see all these different property names with lowercase letters. So in general, you should expect to see lowercase letters at the start of every property name. It just happens that this API author decided to use uppercase instead. So unfortunately, we have to follow that same convention at some locations inside of our code. Okay, so now whenever we call fetch data, we're going to get back our array of different movies we fetched. So inside of onInput, let's make sure that we take whatever comes out of fetch data and assign it to a variable. So I'll say const movies is fetch data. And then right after that, I'll do another console log of movies. If we save this and run it, we're going to very quickly see something unexpected. So of course, let's do that right away. I'll flip back over, refresh, I'll run it again, and now I see a console log of a promise. So what's going on here? I'm seeing a promise instead of an array of movies, which is what I kind of expected to see. Well, remember, fetch data is an async function. We marked it with the async keyword. So whenever we call fetch data, it's going to take some amount of time to actually process this request, and then eventually return the data that we get back. Right now, when we call fetch data, we are treating it as though it were a synchronous function. So if we want to somehow wait on fetch data to actually get some data and get access to the response, we have to treat it as though it were an async function. So in other words, we need to put the await keyword right in front of it. And now because we are using the await keyword inside the onInput function, we have to mark that function as being async as well. Okay, so let's save this and try to run it again. If I refresh and put in Avengers, now I can see my list of different movies being printed out. Okay, so that's definitely better. All right, now that we've got our data inside of onInput, let's take another quick pause. When we come back in the next video, we're going to start to iterate over our list of movies and turning each one into a snippet of HTML and then throw it onto our document. Now that we have all of our data inside the onInput function, let's make sure that we can iterate over this list of movies right here. And for every movie that we have fetched, we're going to try to create a div element that kind of summarizes the movie. In particular, I want to take every movie that we fetch. I want to get the poster printed out as an image on the screen. and I want to show the title for every movie as well. So let's get to it. I'm going to remove that console log, and I'm going to replace it with a for of loop. So I'll say for let movie of movies, like so. Now we can use a for of loop right here. We could use a normal for loop. We could use a while loop, a for each, a map statement. It's really up to you. Personally, I rather enjoy using for of loops because they're really easy to see and pretty easy to understand as well. So as we start to iterate over this list of movies right here, we're going to get the movie variable inside the loop. So that movie variable is going to be the same objects that we're looking at inside of our console right here. So that right there is going to be the first movie variable. And then we're going to go over the second movie, and then so on. So now inside of my loop, I'm going to create a div. I'm then going to set the inner HTML on this div. So I'll say div.innerHTML. I'm going to use a set of backticks here, like so, because I want to have a multi-line string so I can nicely format my HTML that I want to write out. Make note that you are supposed to use backticks here. We cannot use single quotes to form a multi-line string in JavaScript. That would be a syntax error. So make sure you have a backtick character instead. So then inside of here, I'm going to display an image that's going to show the poster for my movie. To get the URL for this image, or the src property, let's take another quick look at the movie object that we are working with. So again, this is the movie object that we are currently working with right here. Notice that it has a poster property, and that is a URL to the poster image for this movie. Also, take note that it's poster with a capital P, so we'll need to make sure that we spell the property with capital P inside of our code as well. So back over here, I'm going to set the src on the image, and remember to inject a JavaScript variable into a string formed with backticks. We use a $ curly braces like so. And then we'll say movie.poster with a capital P. Now this right here is not quite correct. There's a very small gotcha in there. In order to write out a correct image tag, we're supposed to write src, a set of double quotes, and then our link inside of there to whatever it might be. Right now, if we ran this code right here, it would just take whatever the URL is and stick the URL directly in without any double quotes. So in other words, we would end up with something like that, which is not quite what we want. Again, we want to have some double quotes around it. So to make sure we get double quotes around, well, we have to put them in ourselves. So I'm going to put double quote right there and a double quote on the other side. Next up, I'm going to put an H1 right after it. Inside that H1, I'm going to try to show the title of the movie. So we can get the title of the movie by referencing the title property. And again, notice that it has a capital T. So inside the H1, I'll do $ curly braces with movie.title. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So now the last thing we need to do is take the div we just created and insert it into our DOM somewhere so that we can actually see it. Let's go back over to our index.html, and we're going to make sure that we create some element inside there that's going to list out all these different divs that we are creating. So I'll go back over, I'll find where we have our class container, and I'm going to add in a div with an ID of target. This is not a really good practice right here to use an ID of target because, well, we might end up with many different targets, so to speak, or things that we want to render content to inside of our application. But to be honest, we're going to very quickly replace this div with something else, like very, very soon, and that's why I'm just going to use it here very temporarily. So now back after we create our div, we can use a query selector to select that element with ID of target that we just added. So I'll do a document.querySelector. I'll look for #target, and I'll append child the div we just created. Okay, and that should be it. So I'm going to save this. I'll go back over. I'll refresh the page. Then I'll do a search for Avengers. And there we go. So I can see my first poster right there. I can see a title, the next one, and so on down the list. So we can definitely at least show some content now. However, I want you to notice that while I was typing this out, I also got an error over here, which is kind of unexpected. So let's take a quick pause. It looks like everything worked, but didn't quite work out quite as expected because we got an error. So we'll come back in just a moment. We're going to figure out why we're seeing this error message, and then we're going to try to fix it. I was able to successfully search for some videos at the very end of the last video and then show them as a list on the screen, along with the title of each. However, as I was typing out Avengers, I saw a little error appear at my console right here. So this is an error that you might or might not be seeing right now. If you're not seeing it, let me show you how you can get that same error very quickly. Try refreshing your app and select your search bar right there, and then enter in a long random string of characters. And as soon as you do, you're probably going to see an error just like that. So what's going on here? We are successfully making our request. You can see that if you still have your network tab open, but we definitely are seeing something around movies not being iterable. Well, let's take a look at the actual response that we're getting back inside this request, and then we can figure out why we're getting this error. So if you select that, you're going to see a response object that looks like that right there. It has an error property and a response. So essentially, we entered in a search term for a movie that has no results whatsoever. So rather than giving us some kind of response that says, hey, here's a list of movies that we found, 0, like an empty array, this API chose to tell us inside of this kind of error message right here that no movies were found whatsoever. So we need to make sure that we go back over to our fetch data function or somewhere inside of our code and handle this case in which we make a request and don't get any results whatsoever. One other thing I want to mention at this time as well is that the search functionality with this API is not quite as great as you might expect. So for example, we've seen several times that we can put in Avengers and get the correct result. But if I only put in the word like AVEN, like so, unfortunately, well, that one happened to like actually turn out. There we go. So if I do AVENG, so only part of the word Avengers, on any normal search engine or search functionality, I would still expect that to give me some results of like the Avengers, because that's part of the word. But unfortunately, this API doesn't really consider partial terms like AVENG. So it doesn't match that with the movie Avengers. And so when I put that in, I still get the same kind of response that says movie not found. So that's just something we need to be aware of as we are testing out our application. We really do have to put in a reasonable title of a movie in order to see any kind of results whatsoever. Okay, so let's go back over to our code, and we're going to figure out some way to fix up our code and handle the case in which we don't get any results at all. Okay, so back over here, I think the most reasonable way to handle this would be to go to our fetch data function. So inside of fetch data, right here, right after we make our request, let's try to look at the response. We're going to inspect response.data, and we're going to see if there was an error that we're getting back when we made the request. One thing I want to kind of mention here is that the errors that we're talking about right now are not like actual request errors. A real request error would be like if we typed in an incorrect URL and we didn't get any kind of response whatsoever. That's not what is happening here. In this case, the request is being issued successfully. We're getting back a status code of 200, which means that everything with the request went A-OK. So this is not really an error in the strictest sense of the word. So in my opinion, this is not the best designed API. Nonetheless, it's what we're working with. So rather than handling an error in a classic sense, we're just going to check to see if the response has an error property. And if it does, then we're just going to return an empty array and say, well, turns out we didn't find any results whatsoever. So back over here, I'm going to say if response.data.error, like so. And again, notice that we have a capital E, because that is what the response is giving us. So if there is an error, let's just return an empty array and essentially say we didn't get any movies whatsoever to show to the user. Okay, so now let's try this again. I'm going to refresh, and I'm going to put in a very strange search term here, so just a bunch of characters. Now I don't see anything on the screen, and I don't have an error either. So this is definitely what I would really expect. If I don't get any results, I don't show any content whatsoever. That might seem a little bit odd, but remember, this is kind of the system that we agreed with right here. We had said that if a user finishes typing and we find no results, we're just not going to show any content. In a perfect world, we would show the user some kind of error message and tell them that, or like a warning or something like that, and tell them, hey, we didn't find any content. But for right now, this is definitely good enough. Okay, so we got that error fixed up. So another quick pause right here, and we'll continue in just a moment. We can now show a list of movie posters and the title of each respective movie. So now all we really have to do, believe it or not, is kind of work on the styling a little bit. In particular, we need to make sure that all these images are small, that they show up next to their titles, and that they all appear in a kind of menu directly underneath that little input right there. So to do so, we're going to use some CSS that is included inside of this project. Remember, at the very start of this section, we downloaded a boilerplate project. Wired up inside this project is a CSS framework called Bulma CSS. Bulma CSS has a collection of different CSS rules that allow you to very quickly style an application. We're going to take a look at a component, or essentially a set of CSS rules that are going to allow us to very quickly turn the content that we have right here into what we're really looking for. So I'm going to open up a new browser tab and navigate to this documentation. Okay, so if we go down on the left-hand side just a little bit, we'll see a demo of what they call a dropdown. Now you might look at this and say, Stephen, we're not making a dropdown, we're making kind of an autocomplete thing. Yes, that's correct, but we can kind of use some of the CSS that's been implemented to make this dropdown to kind of leverage it for what we are trying to create. So the only effective difference between what you see right here and what we are trying to make is the fact that we want to show a text input right there instead of a button. They have a button, we just want to have a text input. So we can very easily swap that out. To get something like what you see right here, all we really have to do is replicate the HTML structure that they have over here on the right-hand side. Now, I'm not going to ask you to read over all that CSS and memorize it. Instead, let's go back over to our project. We're going to write in some of the CSS that you see right here directly to our HTML file. And I'll show you how quickly and easily we can replicate something that looks like that. Okay, so back over. I'm going to find my index.html file. I'm going to go down to the very bottom, and I'm going to find my input element. Right above that input element, I'm going to add in a new div with a class of dropdown and is-active. I'm going to put the closing div on the other side of the input. So this div right here is going to wrap our input element. Then immediately after that, I'm going to create another div with a class of dropdown-menu. I'll close it off. Inside of there, I'm going to create another div with the class of dropdown-content. Close that one off. And then finally, I'm going to make a couple of anchor tags. So an anchor tag like so with a class of dropdown item. I'll then close off the anchor tag. And inside the anchor tag, I'll put in movie number 1. And then I'm going to copy paste that anchor tag twice like so, and just update the text. So all I'm doing here is using the same HTML that we just saw inside the Bulma documentation. By using the same HTML with the same class names, all the Bulma CSS rules that are included inside this project are going to kick in effect and try to style this block of HTML right here. So even though we are not trying to create a dropdown per se, we can still leverage that set of CSS rules for styling our application. Okay, so I'm going to save this. I'm going to flip back over, refresh, and now I see at least what kind of looks like a menu right here of sorts. I know it's pushed up against the left-hand side, but it kind of looks like what we're going for. I've got a list of items. I can kind of hover over them. When I hover over them, I get that nice little pointer cursor thing, like with the hand with the little finger. And so it's very evident to a user that I can click on this. So all you and I really have to do now is, instead of showing these anchor tags that say movie number 1, 2, and 3, we need to just take our movie images, so like the poster and movie title, and stick it into this anchor tag. And then everything should essentially show up correctly and nicely styled in our application. So now that we understand what our goal is in the short term, let's take a quick pause, because there is something to kind of think about on how we approach this problem. So quick pause, and we'll discuss a little interesting side topic in the next video. We just added in a bunch of HTML directly to our index.html file. So now in theory, we could go back over to our JavaScript code, try to select these different anchor elements, and then update the content inside them to show the movie poster and the title. In theory, that would work. But before we do that, we kind of have a choice to make here about how we're going to implement this autocomplete widget. Let me show you a diagram to help you understand the decision that we have to make. Okay, so this is option number 1 right here, and this is kind of what the path is that we're walking down right now. So right now, in this kind of option, we would write out all the HTML that is required, or at least as much as possible, inside of our HTML document. So in other words, we would write out that div with class dropdown. We would write out the input inside there, then the dropdown menu, the content, and then eventually render out all the dropdown items inside there. And then inside of our index.js file, we would write out some code that looks like this. It would try to select probably like that div with class dropdown or some like autocomplete class or something like that, and then set up an event listener on the input inside there. And then whenever a user does a search, we would then take the results, generate all those options, and throw all the different results, like all the different anchor tags, into that dropdown content div. And this right here might seem like a really obvious way to do it, right? Like, what other way is there? Well, there actually is another way to approach this problem. One thing I want to highlight about this is that we are making some really big assumptions between the contents of our HTML file and the contents of our JavaScript file. In other words, our JavaScript code is not going to work correctly if our HTML file doesn't have exactly the correct structure. In other words, this code, this entire setup, would not work correctly at all if we did not have that input element. If we accidentally deleted or moved that input element, our JavaScript code would probably not work correctly. Likewise, if we did not have the correct spelling on this class right here of dropdown content, which is where we want to put all of our anchor elements that represent each individual video, if we misspelled that class name or moved it somewhere else inside of our project, that's pretty much it. Our JavaScript code is no longer going to work correctly either. So in other words, we've got a very distinct coupling between our HTML document and our JavaScript file. The two of them work very closely together, and if we change either, we might break our entire application. So with that in mind, let's take a look at another way of approaching this. This would be option number 2. Okay, so in option number 2, we are going to have way less HTML inside of our index.html file. So to represent our entire autocomplete widget, maybe we could get away with only creating one single element, a div with a class of autocomplete or something like that. So in this scenario, we would create just the bare root of our widget inside of our HTML document. And then instead of putting all the HTML inside there, inside of our HTML document, we would instead rely upon our JavaScript code to go through the process of creating all the HTML that is required for us. So in other words, we would try to maybe select this div right here, and then we would run some code to create an input in there for us. We would then handle the input, like in other words, deal with change events. We would run our search on the API, and then we would add in all of the different HTML required to show that dropdown. So add in all the HTML for the dropdown menu, dropdown content, and so on. So in this scenario, we're essentially dumping all the responsibility of producing HTML off to the JavaScript side of our application. That might sound like a lot more work on our side, but in reality, it kind of makes life a little bit easier because no longer are we going to have a strong coupling between our index.html file and the JavaScript file. Now all we have to do is make sure that we have got one div inside of here with a class of autocomplete, and then we should be able to just run some code inside of our index.js file that will find that div and set up our entire autocomplete widget inside there. So no expectations whatsoever about the HTML that's inside of that div. This right here is a way more flexible approach, because with this approach, you and I can much more easily create reusable widgets that we can reuse between different projects. It also makes it much more easy to share our code with other developers. Imagine sharing both these options with some friend of yours who wants to implement the same kind of autocomplete widget. If you were using option number 1 up here, you would have to tell your friend, okay, first you're going to go over to your HTML document, you're going to put together this div, and it has to have an input, make sure it has an input, and it has to have these two divs and they have to be nested in this very particular way. Just imagine trying to communicate that to some other engineer. Maybe it's as easy as just copy pasting them some snippet of HTML, but at the end of the day, that's definitely a decent amount to communicate over to them. However, if you were using option number 2, you could tell your friend, oh yeah, just create this div with a class of autocomplete, and then run this JavaScript function. Run like some function called create autocomplete. And boom, that's it. Everything will be set up for that other engineer automatically. So throughout this course, we've largely been using option number 1. But as we move forward, we're going to be moving towards option number 2. we're going to try to limit the amount of coupling between our HTML document and our JavaScript file. And again, the entire idea here is that it's going to lead to greater reuse of the different widgets we put together. And it's also going to lead to less coupling between our different files of our project. Okay, so now we understand why we're going to take this kind of approach. Obviously, it's going to require us to add in a pretty good amount of additional JavaScript code, and we're going to have to make a couple changes to our HTML document. But I just wanted to kind of set you up and get you to understand why we are about to write all the code that we're going to write. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute. We just spoke about the differences of creating a bunch of HTML to support a widget inside of our HTML file versus our JavaScript code. Now, one thing I want to mention here is that this discussion is really about the creation of JavaScript-heavy reusable widgets. There's still going to be many times where you're going to want to create some HTML inside of an HTML document, and that's totally fine. We're really just thinking about moving HTML generation over to our JavaScript code when we are thinking about widgets that we want to make easily reusable between different projects or even on the same project. For this autocomplete, we know that we need to show two different autocompletes on the screen. And so our options are to either write out all that code one time, all that HTML structure one time inside of our JavaScript file, or write it out twice inside the index.html file. So definitely the easier thing to do is create some JavaScript code that can create this widget for us as many times as we want. But there's definitely going to be some other elements that we're going to throw directly into our HTML file. For example, that header element that's already visible right there. That's not something that is quite appropriate to try to display from our JavaScript code. So because that thing is there's only one, there's not really any interactivity, I don't expect to reuse it, totally appropriate to create that inside of our HTML file. Okay, so back over, we're going to do a little bit of a refactor and move some of this HTML generation to our JavaScript. So that involves essentially deleting a lot of the HTML that we just wrote out here. I know it's kind of a pain to delete some of the HTML that we just wrote, but I wanted to write this out for two reasons. First off, so you understood the difference between option number 1 and option number 2. And secondly, so that you just understood that if we use this HTML structure right here with these very particular class names, Bulmic CSS would kick in and style that stuff for us automatically. So I apologize to delete stuff we just wrote, but again, that's why we did it. Okay, so I'm going to find everything inside of class container and delete it. And we're going to replace it with one single element instead. I'm going to do a div with the class of autocomplete, like so. So now we can go back over to our JavaScript code. We're going to select that element. So back over, right above where we get that input, I'm going to add in some code to select that thing. I'm going to call it root because it kind of represents the root element of our autocomplete widget. So we'll do a query selector with .autocomplete. And then immediately after that, we're going to do a root.innerHTML and put in all the HTML that we need to make our autocomplete widget work. So essentially, we're talking about adding in all the HTML that we just deleted from the HTML file. So it might seem like we're just kind of shoveling HTML creation from one location to another. That's totally accurate. That is what we're doing. Again, the point is to reduce the coupling between these different files. The HTML still has to be created somewhere. We're just moving it over to the JavaScript side. Okay, so inside of this thing, we're going to add in pretty much the same structure we just had, but I'm going to put in one or two more elements and class names that's just going to kind of represent the final styling of this widget that we're going for. So I'm going to put in a label that has a B element to bold the text in here. And for the text, I'll say search for a movie. I'll then close off the B element and close off the label. After that, I'll put down the input. We still need an input. I'm going to give this one a class of input, like so. And then after that, I'm going to start to show the dropdown. Now previously, we wrapped up the input with the dropdown. This time, for no great reason, we're just going to do things slightly differently. So I'm going to put the dropdown right after the input element. So I'll show a div with the class of dropdown. I'm going to close that off. Inside there, I'll do a div with the class of dropdown-menu and close it off. And then finally, a div with the class of dropdown content. And this time around, I'm also going to put in a class name of results that is just for some additional little styling. Just some CSS. No other special reason for that class besides a little bit of styling. Okay, so now we are creating all of our HTML on the JavaScript side, and that means we can create as many of these autocomplete widgets as we want eventually. So now we're going to go through this and we're going to select a couple of the different elements inside of here that we know that we're going to need. We already have a selector for that input. We're going to make sure that we also get a selector for that div right there that says drop down content, because remember, that's where we're going to eventually show all the different search results that we get. We're also going to get a selector for this div with class of dropdown as well. The reason for that is that we can hide and show the drop-down menu depending upon whether or not this element has a class of is-active. This is not some like magic JavaScript thing. This is another little bit of styling from Bulma CSS. If we actually go back over to the documentation over here, you'll notice that the root element in their example has is-active. If that element has the class is-active, then the dropdown is going to be displayed. Otherwise, if the class is not there, the dropdown will be hidden. That is normal CSS behavior. They just have a little CSS selector to say either apply a display of block or none to this thing to show and hide it. So we're going to leave off is active because by default we want this thing to be closed. But like I said, we're going to get a selector to that element so we can add that class on eventually and open or close the dropdown. So next to our input element right here, we're going to add in some more selectors to get those two other elements we just discussed. One to open the thing up and one to eventually render some contents inside there. So I'm going to add in a selector for dropdown, and that will be document.querySelector.dropdown. And I'll also get a, we'll call it, how about results wrapper? That'll be a document.querySelector or .results. And as you would guess, that's that element right there. I'm calling it results wrapper because essentially it's going to wrap all the rendered results that we're trying to show to the user. Okay, so this looks good. Now this video is going a little bit long, so let's take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next video, we're going to update some of the code inside of our onInput function to make sure that we render some input, or excuse me, some output into these particular elements. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute. All right, let's continue working on our widget here. The last thing we have to do is make a couple updates inside of onInput to refer to the elements that we just selected instead of some elements that we just deleted actually. So like for example, right now as we loop over all of our different movies and create some divs, we're trying to append them to document.querySelector ID of target. So that element doesn't exist anymore. Remember, we said that we want to take all these different elements that we create and put them inside of that div right there. So we just have to update a couple of different references, that's all. Okay, so to get started, right before the for loop, we're going to take a look at the drop-down element. As we just discussed in the last video, to make sure that we open up the menu, we have to add the isActive class to that element right there. So right above the for loop, I'll say dropdown.classList.add, and we're going to add on the class is-active. So we're going to do that right after we fetch all of our data successfully. So we're going to fetch all of our data, open up the dropdown, and then add in all of our movies to it. So then inside of our for loop, as I just mentioned, this element right here doesn't exist anymore. Instead, we want to apply or append all these different divs that we create to the results wrapper. And the results wrapper is that thing right there. So on the query selector, I'm going to delete the query selector, and I will replace it with results wrapper. All right, just one or two more changes. If we go back over to the Bulma documentation, you'll recall that as we show each individual item inside the dropdown, there's supposed to be anchor elements with a class of dropdown item. Right now, as we loop through all of our different videos or our different movies, we are creating a div element. So that's not quite correct. We need to update that to be an anchor element instead. So to do so, I'm going to update the document.createElement to make an anchor tag, or A, instead of div. And then to be complete, we should probably update the div variable name, since we're technically not creating a div anymore. A name for this could be like anchor, because we are creating an anchor element, but that doesn't really convey the context of the code we're writing here. I personally kind of like the name option. Option might seem a little bit weird, but the idea here is that we are creating like a drop-down or an autocomplete. And inside there, we're going to show a lot of different options of movies that users can click to select one of these. So I think the term option kind of makes sense in that context. So I'm now going to go through and update div right there and right there as well to refer to the option variable since div doesn't exist anymore. So I'll change that to option. And on append child, I'll change it to option as well. Okay, just one or two more quick changes. Inside of the option element, we currently have the image, which is definitely good, but we have the movie text inside of an H1, which might be just slightly too large. So I'm just going to take off the H1, the opening and the closing tag. All right, so there should be just one last little thing to do here. Right above the option element, as we were just looking at the Bulma documentation, remember I just said that we have to add in a class of drop-down item to get everything to style nicely. So right above where we set inner HTML, I'm going to also do an option class list dot add drop-down dash item, like so. Okay, and that should be it. So I'm going to save this, and we should be ready to flip back over to our browser and test this out. So I'm going to go back over. I'm going to refresh, and right away you're going to see that this looks a lot better than how it looked before. We've got the nicely bolded label, and the input looks a lot better as well because we added in a class of input to that thing. So now inside of here, I'm going to do a search for Avengers. And as soon as I do so, I see this nice drop-down open. And so I can kind of hover over each of these. I get the nice kind of hover effect. I got the nice finger right there. All the styling that you're seeing here is coming from Bulma. And so I know that working with Bulma and having to understand this drop-down stuff was kind of probably annoying, but I think you can agree with me that this looks pretty awesome right here. Like this definitely looks really good. Now, as good as it looks, there's definitely still some things we have to do to make our widget work as expected. In particular, you might recall that we spoke about all the different ways in which our drop-down is going to behave. Remember, we had said stuff like, oh yeah, if a user clicks outside the drop-down, close the menu. Well, right now, if I click outside the drop-down, the thing stays open. So definitely not appropriate. In addition, if I do another search, so let's say that I look up Dark Knight, I'm going to see, as I scroll down, that all those results get appended to the very end of the list. So we still have a little bit of work to do. So let's take a quick pause right here and continue solving a couple of these little issues in the next video. Okay, so our autocomplete definitely looks great, but like I just mentioned, there's a couple more things we need to do for it. So first off, we need to make sure that whenever we fetch a new list of videos, we clear out the existing ones inside there. That's going to be pretty straightforward, so let's take care of that task first. So the big question here is, when should we clear out the existing list? Well, remember, inside of onInput, we are making a request to fetch our data right here. After we fetch some data, we should probably clear out any existing items before we attempt to add any more in. So right above where we have drop-down class list add, let's add in some code to take a look at our results wrapper. Remember, that is the thing that is going to eventually contain all the different rendered results that we get. So right above drop-down class list add, I will add in results wrapper. And to clear the thing out, we could do a simple inner HTML is empty string like so. So let's save that. I'm going to flip back over. We'll do a refresh. And I'll search for Avengers. And I'll do a search for Dark Knight. And there we go. That's much better. Now, one thing you might notice as I search for Dark Knight, and you might see this or you might not, it looks like the last result in here has a broken image. And inside my console, I also see an error as well. So you might not see that. It really depends upon the movie that you are searching for. Let's take a look at the API response that we're getting inside of our network request tab and try to understand why we are seeing a broken image there. So I'm going to open up my most recent request to the API. I'm going to take a look at the list of results we get back. I'm going to select Dark Knight right there. So you'll notice that in this case, we have a poster property of NA, which means that there is no poster image available. Normally, that poster is going to be the link to the actual image. So the reason that we're seeing this error is that we're essentially throwing in the string NA as an image source. And we can actually confirm that by inspecting that element, inspecting the image, and you'll see that the image very plainly has an src of NA. And that's why we're seeing this nasty error down here. So to get this fixed, and again, you might not be seeing this yet, but you probably will eventually, we just have to add in a check for NA, essentially, and make sure that if we ever see it, well, we probably just don't want to show the image at all. So to do so, I'm going to go back over. I'm going to find where we create the inner HTML for each individual option. So that's where we create the image right there. So all we have to do is add in a quick check beforehand to decide whether or not we want to show this image. To do so, right after we create the option, I'm going to say const image src, like so. And I'm going to use a little ternary expression here. So I'm going to say if item.poster, remember with a capital P, is equal to n/a, then I want to assign a value of empty string to image src. Otherwise, if it is not equal to na, I want to assign item.P poster to image src instead. So again, this is a ternary expression. We're going to first evaluate that expression right there. If that is a truthy expression, then we're going to return whatever is between the question mark and the colon. Otherwise, if that is falsy, we will assign item.poster over to image.src. So now we can use image src in place of movie.poster. If we show an image element with an empty string, it's essentially just not going to show up inside the DOM. Well, it's going to technically show up on the DOM, but it won't show up on the screen, which is going to solve this issue. So I'm going to put image src inside there, like so. All right, so I'm going to refresh. I'm going to look for dark night again. And it looks like I probably made a typo inside there. Sorry, I called it item. It is not item, it is movie. That is better. My mistake. Okay, that's better. So I'll do dark night. And the last one down here, don't have an image. Totally fine. I mean, that's life. There is no image to show, but we are not trying to show some like non-existing image and showing a broken image or anything like that. So this definitely looks good. So I think the last big thing we have to take care of is to make sure whenever a user clicks out of the input, like I'm clicking over here right now, we need to make sure that we close this thing up. So let's figure out how we can do that in the next video. The next little fix we're going to add in is to make sure that if a user searches for something and then decides they don't want to select a video and clicks somewhere else, we want to close the menu. So essentially, we need to really detect when a user clicks anywhere on the screen that is not inside of that menu. Now, believe it or not, adding in some code for this is not the easiest thing in the world, and it's actually kind of deceptively challenging. There is a little trick to it, however, and this trick is going to seem a little bit weird, but it's probably the best and easiest way to handle this. To understand the trick, I'm going to first write out a little demonstration in my console. So inside my console with my DevTools open, I'm going to right-click on the label right there, search for a movie, and I'm going to click Inspect on it. That's going to open up my Elements panel and select the B element. Whenever I click an element in this Elements panel, you'll see right after the HTML snippet, I get $=$0. And if you hover over it, you can type in $0 in the console to refer to that element. So if I open up my console at the same time, which by the way you can do by hitting Escape, we can write in $0, and that will print out the reference to that element. Just so you know, $0 is a valid JavaScript identifier. That is not some like magic operator or something. It is a normal, completely valid, totally legal JavaScript variable name. Okay, so now that I've got a selector to that element, I want to show you the little trick. I'm going to get reference to the entire document, and I'm going to call document.contains, and then pass in $0. So what this checks is to see if the element that I currently have selected, in this case that label right there, is contained within the document element. If it is contained, because remember we view the DOM as a sort of tree, then we're going to get back true. In this case, the element inside the document definitely is contained. But if we try to check the reverse relationship, so $0.contains document, we're going to get back false. Oops, typo. We're going to get back false, like so. So that means that the label does not contain the document. So I just want you to keep that in your head for just a moment. Keep it in your head. We're going to go back over and write a little bit of code to handle closing that input menu or the drop-down menu. Okay, so back over here, I'm going to say document.addEventListener. So this is kind of the crazy part. We are adding a global event listener to our entire document. And we're going to watch for any time that anyone clicks on any element whatsoever. Now remember how events work in JavaScript. Events bubble, which means that if some element contained inside the document, like let's say the container right here, or even the text inside of it, if someone clicks on that, that's going to trigger a click event on that element. If it doesn't get handled right there, then the event is going to essentially bubble up until it gets to the top level of our entire HTML document. In this case, the document. So this event right here, we can look at console.log event.target. And as we start to click around, we're going to see that this is going to print out a variety of different elements, essentially whatever element we click on. So I'm going to go back over again. I'm going to refresh. And now if I start to click around, like on the label, I'll see the label text. I can click on the H1, the icon right there, the header, anywhere else, the input, whatever else. And whenever I click on it, I see the console log appear. Okay, so now here's the real final conclusion of all this. So we know that event target is going to tell us what gets clicked. We know that we also have that contains element as well, or excuse me, that contains method. So the whole big trick here, the whole kind of conclusion to all this, is that we can take a look at our root element. Remember, the root element encapsulates everything having to do with our autocomplete. So we're going to check to see if the element that was clicked on is contained inside of root. If it is contained inside, that means that the user clicked on the label, the input, or the dropdown. And in any of those scenarios, we want to keep the dropdown open. But if the click is not contained inside of the root, then the user clicked somewhere else in the document, and so we should close the dropdown. That's the whole conclusion. I apologize in coming to it in a roundabout way, but that is the trick. That's how we're going to do this. So inside of our event listener down here, we're going to say if not root.contains event.target. So that's saying if the root element for our little autocomplete doesn't contain the element that was just clicked on, then we need to close the dropdown. And remember, to open or close the dropdown, we can get a reference back to the dropdown element right here, which is essentially that thing right there. And we can add or remove the class is-active. We just added in some code a little bit ago to add in the class is-active, which opens it up. So to close it, we're going to remove that class, and that will close the dropdown. Okay, so down here, I'll do dropdown.classList.remove is-active, like so. And I'll save, flip back over, refresh. I'll go for Dark Night. Now I'm going to click anywhere else, and the dropdown closes. If I do another search for, let's say, Avengers, I can click on anything inside here. So I can click on the input, click on the label. I click on anything inside of the entire autocomplete widget, and this thing stays open as we would hope. All right, so that definitely looks like it's working correctly. So just one last little fix I want to take care of in the next video. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute. There's one last fix I want to take care of very quickly. Right now, if we do a search for something, so like I'm going to search for Avengers. Oops, I accidentally closed it. There we go. And then I delete this. The input stays open, or excuse me, the dropdown stays open, but with nothing inside of it, which is definitely not appropriate. So we just need to make sure that we do a little check inside of our code. And we say that if we get back no results at all from our fetch data function, we should probably close the dropdown. So we just spoke about how we open and close the dropdown, so this should be pretty straightforward. Back up right after we check to see if we, or excuse me, right after we get some data, let's take a look at movies. And we're going to say that if there are no movies whatsoever, if we didn't fetch any data, let's just return early and not run anything else inside of here. So I'm going to say if not movies.length. So if there are no movies, then let's make sure that we close the dropdown. So I'm going to do a dropdown class list.remove is-active. And then we're going to return entirely from this function because we don't want to try to render anything or even open the dropdown back up or anything like that. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Let's do a quick save and a test. I'm going to once again search for Avengers, and I'll delete it, and the dropdown goes away. All right, well, I'd say that's looking pretty good. So our autocomplete widget is now in a really good state, and there's really only one last major interaction we have to add. We need to make sure that a user can actually click on a video to select it. Right now, we can click on a video all day, but nothing is really happening. So let's take a quick pause and handle that last major interaction in the next video. Our autocomplete has a couple of things fixed up now, so we get to now start to think about adding in some additional features to it. The next thing we need to do is to make sure that once a user searches for something and then clicks on an option right here, we have to somehow handle that click. We spoke about what to do whenever a user clicks on an entry a little bit ago. So remember, we had said that we want to update the text inside the input. So we want to update the text from whatever the user had just typed, like Avengers right here, to the exact title of the movie that the user clicked on. So instead of saying Avengers, it should say The Avengers inside of that input. In addition, we need to make sure that we also close the menu. Finally, and this isn't really in this diagram right here, but the last thing we need to do as well is to make sure that whatever movie a user clicks on, we need to essentially render it out really large on the left-hand side of the screen, because that is the end goal of this application. But for right now, let's just make sure that whenever we search for something and click on it, we update the text and we close the dropdown. So what we really need to do here is to detect a click on an individual option. To do so, I'm going to once again find my onInput function. Inside of there, we've got our for/of loop, where we create a bunch of different anchor elements. We then add on some classes and set some inner HTML and whatnot. So to detect a click on one of those options, we can add in a click event handler to that option variable. Remember, the option variable is an anchor element. To add in a click event handler, right underneath where we set the inner HTML, I'm going to do an option.addEventListener. And we're going to watch for not a lick event, but a click event. So then inside of here, we can do the two things we just discussed. We want to update the value of the input, and we also want to make sure that we close the dropdown as well. Closing the dropdown is something we've spoke about several times now. Remember, to toggle whether or not the dropdown is open, we add or remove the class isActive to the dropdown element. And the dropdown element is that one right there. So let's take care of that first. Inside of my event listener, I'll do a dropdown.classList.remove is-active. So let's save that and do a very quick test. I'll refresh. Avengers. So now I'm going to click on the Avengers and the entire dropdown closes. Very good. So now the next thing we need to do is to make sure that we update the text inside of the input. Once again, remember that we've got a reference to that input on the input variable right there. So we can update the value of that text input by going back down to our event listener, and we'll say input.value. That's how we can change the value inside of an existing input. And we're going to update it to the title of the movie that the user just clicked on. We can get the title of the movie that the user just clicked on by using the closure scope of this function right here. Remember, the closure scope is essentially everything outside of that arrow function. So right outside that function, we've still got a reference to the movie variable, and that is the object that has all the information about the movie that the user just clicked on. So we could do movie.title. And as I've mentioned many times, remember, title with a capital T, because this API property names are just a little bit strange. So we're going to take that title, shove it into input.value, and that should update the text on the screen inside the input. So let's do another save here. I'll flip back over, refresh. I'll search for Avengers, and now if I click on any of these right here, I would expect to see the text inside the input update as well. And there we go. Very good. Okay, so this looks like we've got something pretty good put together now. I'd say that our autocomplete element is just about done. So now the last thing we have to do is think about how to take the movie that the user just clicked on and render out some details about it on the screen, just like we said we would do with the original mockups of this application. So like this right here. We want to show the image, title, some statistics, and so on. So another quick pause, and we'll start to address that in the next video. Like we said at the end of the last video, we now need to take the movie that the user just selected and show some details about it right here. There's just one or two things to be aware of. First off, I want to remind you that the OpenDB API that we're using has those two different endpoints that we're making use of. Right now, we've got some results coming back from the by search method right here, and that only gives us some very limited pieces of information about every movie. So when a user selects an actual movie, that means that we need to do a follow-up request to the API, and we need to then attempt to fetch that movie by ID. Once we do the request by ID, that's going to give us a very much expanded set of information about this particular movie. And it's going to give us stuff like the critic ratings and the box office take and the plot summary and so on. So in other words, once a user clicks on the movie and we detect it right here, we need to make a follow-up request get some more information, and then use that to update some content on the screen. We could definitely add all that code right here inside of our event listener. So we can add in a ton of code and say, okay, do another request, get data, render data, and so on. But I bet you could very quickly imagine that that's going to be a fair bit of code. This file, the index.js file that we're working on, already has a lot of code inside of it, and it's all kind of a hodgepodge of different stuff right now. And so if we start to add in all this additional code directly into this event listener, well, this file is going to get even more challenging to read and understand. So instead of tucking all that logic in right there, I think that we should make some other helper function inside this file. Maybe something called like onMovieSelect or something. And inside of that helper function, we can make sure that we attempt to do all that extra logic, do the extra request, render that additional content onto the screen. So I'm going to imagine that we're going to define another helper function inside this file called onMovieSelect. And I'm going to call that with the movie that the user just clicked on. So now let's go define this helper function, and then we can put all that additional logic inside there. So I'm going to go down to the bottom of the file. I'm going to define onMovieSelect. It's going to be called with some movie object. And for right now, let's just do a console log. Now, I'm sure I don't need to prove to you that we're going to call this function successfully. Like, hey, that's definitely going to work. I don't have any reason to suspect it won't work. The reason I just want to do a console log right here is to just remind you some of the properties that we currently have access to and the properties that we're going to need to make the follow-up request to our API and get that additional amount of data. Okay, so let's save this. I'm going to go back over. I will refresh. I'll once again do the Avengers. Click on it, and I see that console log. So again, I just want to remind you that inside of the current data set that we have right here about this one very particular movie, we've got that property called IMDb ID. And notice how ID is capital for both letters. So that is the ID that we're going to use to make our follow-up request to the API. We're going to do the follow-up request. We're going to pass that ID in as a parameter called I, and that is what is going to give us all that additional data about the movie. Okay, so inside of here, I'm going to make this into an async function so that we can then go ahead and use the await syntax and Axios to make our follow-up request. So I will write out const response is await axios.get. I'm going to go back up to the top of the file and get the URL from the first request we made up here. So I'm going to get that URL right there just to save myself a little bit of typing. And you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and copy the entire Axios get function because we need that params and the API key as well. So I'm just going to copy all that stuff. I'm going to go back down to the bottom and put it in like so. Then inside of here, we just need to make sure that we update the params object. Rather than passing along a param of s, which is what is used for doing a search, we instead want to do an individual lookup. So like we just saw, we need to provide a parameter of the letter I, and that is going to be the movie IMDb ID. So I'll put in I, and we want that value to come from the movie that we just selected, .imdb, capital I, capital D. So then after that, we'll do a quick console log of the data. So response.data like so. Okay, so let's try this out again. Just make sure we still have the data we expect. So I'll do a search for the Avengers. I'll click on it, and there we go. We do the follow-up request and get all that additional data about this particular movie. Well, now that we've got all the data, we can now start to think about taking that information and rendering it out. So we're going to essentially just have to write out a lot of HTML to build up this kind of structure right here. So as you probably would guess, quick pause, and we'll start to write that stuff out in the next video. Like I just mentioned, now that we've got this expanded piece of information about the movie, we're going to start to write out a lot of different HTML to get that kind of structure right there. We're going to end up printing out several different properties about the movie that are not shown inside this mockup. So in reality, we're not going to only show the box office take and critic rating, we're also going to show stuff like the awards that the movie won and the number of votes that it's gotten on IMDb, the rating on IMDb, and so on. So a couple other elements besides what is just pictured inside of here. Now, I'm going to tell you right up front that we're going to write out a lot of HTML to get this structure inside this video. All the HTML that we are about to write and all the class names are essentially taken directly from the Bulma CSS framework. Remember, we discussed that this project is using this framework a little bit ago. So essentially, I went through, took a look at all the documentation, and I figured out some HTML structure and class names that would give us something that looks like this right here. So I'm not making up all these class names and whatnot off the top of my head. Instead, these are all corresponding to styling sets that are included inside of Bulma. Okay, so let's go back over. Here's on movie select right here. That's where we just got our response with all the information about one particular movie. So we're going to take that object right there, pull off a ton of different properties from it, and stick it into some big HTML snippet. This is going to end up being a lot of HTML, so rather than stuffing it all inside of onMovieSelect, I'm going to instead make another helper function called movieTemplate. I'm going to receive an argument to this function that I will call movieDetail. I'm calling it movieDetail right here. Just to be clear, that argument is going to be this really big object with all the specific properties of a movie, just to distinguish between the movie object that we had back up here. This movie object right here is more like a movie summary. It just has the title, the poster, and like year and one or two other properties. That's pretty much it. So I just want to have these two different variable names, movie versus movie detail, to indicate that this is just like an abbreviated object of all the different movie properties. This is like the detailed object about all the different movies properties. Then I'm going to, inside of here, movie template, I'm going to return a multi-line string. So once again, set of backticks. And inside there, we're going to write out a whole bunch of HTML. And again, this is all about getting that content right there on the screen. So let's get to it. A lot of writing. So we're going to write that out rather quickly. Please triple check your spelling as you're going through this. So I'm going to do an article with a class of media. I'll close off the article. I'll put in a figure with the class of media-left. Close off the figure. I'm going to do a paragraph element with a class of image. And inside there, an image with a src. I'm going to put in the double quotes because remember, we need those when we are trying to stick some image source inside of this tag. And then we're going to get the poster property of the movie detail. So here's that object that we're working with right now. We want that poster property right there with a capital P. So for the source, I'll do $ curly braces, and then movie detail.poster with a capital P. And then I'll close off the image tag like so. Okay, so that's the first block. Now we're going to add on something after the closing figure tag. So after the closing figure tag, I'll do a div with the class of media-content. Close off the div. Inside there, I'll do a div with the class of content. Close off the div. And inside there, I'll do an h1. I'm going to reference, once again, a JavaScript variable, so $ curly braces. I'll get movie detail.title, so that's going to be the title of the movie. As usual, notice the capital T for title. I'll then do an h4, and inside there, movie detail.genre, so that's going to be the genre of the movie, so is it an action movie, a mystery, horror, suspense, drama, whatever else. And then after the h4, a paragraph with $ curly brace, and you know what, just to be consistent, this really should be on the same, or a single line. So $ curly braces, movie.plot. So that's going to be a plot summary of the movie. I want to remind you that all these movie detail properties, so poster, title, genre, and plot, should all have starting capital letters. So let's save this really quickly. We're going to try to call movie template. We're going to pass in our movie detail that we just got back from the API up here, and then we're going to append that somewhere into the DOM. So we're essentially just going to test out just that snippet right there. We're not done with all the HTML that we need, but we've got enough that we should just do a very quick test to make sure that we don't have anything too crazy. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is to make sure that we have somewhere to render this template inside of our DOM. So I'm going to go back into my index.html file. Right after my autocomplete element, I'm going to put in a div with an ID of summary. We are going to eventually replace this element, but we're just going to leave it here for now for testing purposes. And then back inside of index.js, I will find onMovieSelect. I'm going to delete the console log. I'll do a document.query selector, and we're going to do a selector of pound, and then get that element that we just put in there, summary. And then I'll say inner HTML will be essentially that string right there. So to get that string, we're going to call movie template, and we'll pass in response.data, which is that big movie object that we just saw at our console just a moment ago. All right, so let's save this. We'll go back over and just do a quick test. Again, this is just to make sure that we don't have any errors in the HTML that we just wrote out. So I will again go for Avengers, click it, and I think I've got a typo somewhere because it says here movie is not defined. So I definitely accidentally wrote out movie instead of, oh, yep, right there, my mistake. I put movie instead of movie detail. That's better. So I'm going to save that. Let's try it again. Avengers, click it. There we go. All right. So we've got something on the screen, and it looks kind of reasonable right now. Kind of looks very similar or somewhat similar to what we said we were trying to build right there. Okay, so this is good progress. Let's take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next video, we're going to start to write out another block of HTML to show all the stats about the movie underneath what we have so far. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute. All right, let's keep writing out some HTML to show all the stats underneath this movie. So back inside my code editor, I'll find the movie template function. We will go down to the bottom, and we're going to add in just a little bit more HTML here. So after the closing article element, I'm going to place another article. I'm going to give it a class of notification, and then a space, is-primary. And then close off the article. Then inside of here, I'll do a paragraph tag with the class of title. Close it off. And inside there, we're going to reference movie detail.awards. So this is going to be a string summary of all of the different awards that this movie has won. We'll see exactly what it looks like in the DOM in just a second. After that, I'm going to put in essentially a label for this statistic. So I'll do another paragraph element with the class of subtitle. And inside of there, I'll say simply awards, like so. Okay, so this right here, this article element, we're going to essentially duplicate this down several times. And inside of every duplicated version, we're going to be referencing a different property off of movie detail and be giving each of them a different label as well. So I'm going to take this article element, I'm going to copy it, and then I'm going to copy it down 4 times. So here's 1, 2, 3, and 4. So now we'll go through each of these and update some of the different properties. I'm going to go up, find the first one. I'll go to the second one, and I'm going to change the second one from awards right there to box office. And I'll change the label right underneath it to box office as well. Next up, I'll go to number 3. I'm going to change that one to awards to Metascore. I'll change the label to Metascore. So again, this is like a rating, essentially, of the movie. The next one, so second to last one, IMDb rating. Notice how in this case I has a lowercase as opposed to all the other property names that start with a capital. The label will be IMDb rating. So this is the rating of the movie according to the website IMDb. And then finally on the last one, we'll change it to IMDb votes and IMDb votes. So that's the number of votes that this movie has gotten on IMDb by different users of that platform. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Let's save this. We've got 5 different properties here. Like I said, a couple added beyond just the 2 that we had mentioned over here back in our original mockup. So I'll save that file. I will refresh. I'll look for Avengers, click it, and there we go. So now I see the Avengers. I see the awards that this movie has won, box office take, the Metascore, the rating on IMDb, and the number of votes that the movie has gotten on IMDb as well. So that's pretty much it. That's like stage 1 of our application. We now have the ability to search for a movie. We've got some autocomplete functionality in there. Once a user selects a movie, we show a lot of information about it on the screen. So now we essentially just have to do a lot of duplicate work. We essentially need to duplicate everything we just did and show a second autocomplete on the right-hand side of the screen. And then once we have all the same functionality for that autocomplete, we'll then just need to make sure that when we search for two different movies, we compare all the different statistics and highlight the higher ones in each category. Okay, so that's some pretty good progress. Let's take a pause right here and start on this next phase in the next video. At the end of the last video, we discussed how the phase 1 of our application is pretty much complete. User can search for something, see some statistics. So normally we would now move on to phase 2, where we would show a second autocomplete on the right-hand side, allow a user to do another search, and then compare some statistics between the two movies. But before we do, we're going to take a look at our current code base. It turns out that the code that we've written so far has some kind of serious issues inside of it. So I want to take a look at the code we've written so far. I want to point out some really big issues with our current implementation, and I want to figure out some ways that we could fix that stuff before we move on to phase 2 of our app. So in other words, we're going to start to do some really big refactors. And the goal of these refactors is to help you get an idea of how to write some more reusable code. Naturally, at the start of this application, I could have just shown you the right way to build this application from start to finish. But I think that you can learn a lot more effectively to see kind of the wrong way, so to speak, to build out an application, which is kind of what we've done so far, and then see a better way to write it. Now, don't think that everything we've written so far is awful. Don't get me wrong. The code we've written so far is 100% A-OK. And if you went to some job, or like an interview, or your first junior position as a JavaScript engineer, and you wrote code like what we've done so far, this would 100% be A-OK. There's not anything that's like inherently wrong with the code that we have. I just want to show you some quick changes we can make to our code base to make it even better than it currently is. And it's all themed around making our code more reusable. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some issues inside of our current code base. Okay, so here's the current overwhelming issue with just about everything inside of our project so far. I would say that just about all of our code touches everything. In other words, just about every function, every block of code, everything kind of reaches around to other variables inside the file and other functions inside the file. Let me give you some practical examples of this, mostly focused around the autocomplete widget. And you're going to get a better sense of right now how our code is just reaching around, referencing a ton of different variables all over the place. So a good example of that is the autocomplete widget. Remember, the autocomplete widget was supposed to be reusable. We spoke a little bit ago about how putting a bunch of HTML inside of our HTML document would lead to making it more challenging to reuse the autocomplete logic over time. Because if we ever wanted to reuse all this autocomplete stuff on another project, we would not only have to copy over a bunch of JavaScript code, but we would also have to copy over some HTML inside of our HTML document. In other words, if we had all the autocomplete HTML inside the HTML document, we had that really strong coupling between those two files, and again, it just made it more challenging to use. So as we start to think about how to make the autocomplete widget actually reusable, it's going to involve the process of making sure that the code inside there doesn't touch everything. Again, let me give you some practical examples of this. The first way in which our autocomplete the first way in which the autocomplete widget kind of touches everything is that it has knowledge of exactly what a movie object is. So let's go back over to our code base and let me show you that. Inside of the onInput function right now, we have a for loop right here. And inside that for loop, we have a couple of different lines of code that take a look at that movie object right there. And in doing so, specifically on line 43, it is very clear that the current implementation of our autocomplete stuff knows exactly what different properties a movie object has. So on this line of code, it's clear that the autocomplete stuff knows that a movie object has a poster property. The autocomplete logic is going to behave very differently based on the presence and value of that poster property. So I would say that if we consider all of our autocomplete stuff right now, like everything from const root right there, all the way down to our add event listener right there for the document, if we look at just this code block, we would say that this autocomplete widget knows exactly about the structure of data that it is working with. Now, why is that bad? Well, it's very simple. Again, imagine that you wanted to reuse all this code on another project. And let's imagine for just a second that maybe you did not want to try to have to like go into all this code right here and change a bunch of different variables or property names in order to get this code to work on another project. So let's imagine that in a perfect world, we could just copy paste all this stuff, reuse it right away. If that were the case, then, well, having these direct references to properties inside the movie object would not be good at all. Because maybe our other project doesn't work with movie objects. Maybe instead it works with, say, like recipes. A recipe probably would not have a poster property. Instead, maybe a recipe object, like a cooking recipe, would have some property called like, I don't know, recipe image or something. So if I wanted to reuse all this code on that other project, I would have to go through it first and update all these property references. That's sign number one that we don't have reusable code just yet. The next instance of this is that our autocomplete has knowledge of exactly what to show for each option. So again, inside of our for loop right here, we are setting the inner HTML on option. So this right here, this image that we're placing and the title of the movie, once again means that our autocomplete code has perfect knowledge and perhaps too much knowledge of what to render or what to display for every option. Maybe, once again, if we were searching for recipes on some other project, maybe we don't have any images to show at all. And maybe we would not want to show that image element. Instead, we would want to show something just like recipe.name or something. So if that were the case, again, we would have to come into all this code, we would have to find where we set the inner HTML for the option, and we would have to update that stuff right there. So that again is another sign that our code is not reusable. In order to change the way in which each option looks, we have to modify the source code of our widget. Finally, the autocomplete stuff has knowledge of what to do when a movie is clicked. So again, if we go back over, take a look at the for of loop, take a look at the click event listener that we set up on each option, we have a direct reference right here to some function called onMovieSelect. Again, for the third time, imagine that we took all this code and moved it to a new project. This code would not work correctly if we did not have a function inside of our file called onMovieSelect. So again, if we were working with recipes, we would have to go into the source code, we would have to find that function call and change it to onRecipe select or something. And then we would have to have some function inside this file called onRecipeSelect. If we moved all this code to another new project after that that worked with maybe, I don't know, blog posts, we would have to change this to onBlogPostSelect. So again, the overriding point here, the point I'm trying to make, is that if we wanted to reuse all this autocomplete stuff on any other project, we would have to copy paste all the code and then go around to all these different lines and update each one of them to work with this new kind of resource that we wanted to use the autocomplete with. The other big issue with our code right now, and specifically around the autocomplete as well, is that we have many different global variables that are referring to specific elements. Now, the reason this is a big problem is that it's going to be really, really hard right now to show a second autocomplete on the screen. So let me show you why that is the case. If we go back up to the top of all of our autocomplete code, so about right here, remember we have a query selector for some element with a class of autocomplete. And then just about everything else inside this file after this is working with this root element. We have many references back to the root variable. So what would we do now if we wanted to show a second autocomplete on the screen? Well, to be honest, we would probably, I'm going to zoom out for this just so you can see this little refactor I'm about to do. Don't make any changes. I'm just going to give you a very quick example here. In order to show the second autocomplete, we would have to take all this autocomplete related code, just about all of it, I think all the way down to like right here or so. We would have to copy all this, put another code section here for like autocomplete number 2, do a duplicate all that stuff, and then go through here in autocomplete number 2 section and update all these references so that the variable names wouldn't conflict with the earlier autocomplete that we defined. So for example, for autocomplete number 2, I would have to do a query selector for a totally different element, like autocomplete-2 or something. And then because I have all these variables that are inside of the same scope, I would have to change root right here to like root2 and root2.innerHTML. And then for these variables right here, again, they're defined earlier up inside the file. So we'd have to do input2, dropdown2, results wrapper2, and then repeat that entire same process with all the other variables inside of here. And so I bet you can imagine really quickly that this is a really, really bad way to approach this problem. And there's got to be some better way to tackle this than having to duplicate all the code and then just arbitrarily change all the variable names in order to just show a second autocomplete. Okay, I'm going to delete that copy paste I just did very quickly and go back to what I had before. And there we go. Okay, so again, that is the big issues with our current implementation. It's essentially all revolving around our current autocomplete widget. It is not at all reusable, and the reasons for that is that it knows exactly what properties a movie has, which means we can't reuse this with a different kind of resource. It knows exactly what to show for each option, which means, well, if we ever want to change that representation, we would have to mess around with the internal source code of the autocomplete. The autocomplete knows exactly what function to call whenever a movie is clicked. And that means, again, that our source code would have to have a function called onMovieSelect or something similar. And then finally, if we ever want to show multiple instances of that autocomplete, well, we would have to duplicate all that code and change a bunch of different variable names. Okay, so that is the big issues with our project right now. Now, I want to repeat one more time that the code we've written is not the worst in the world, and we did not just waste like an hour of our time putting together the first implementation of this project. I am just suggesting that perhaps there is a better way, even better than what we've written out so far. So, with all this in mind, now that we understand what is wrong with our project, we're going to start to refactor all this stuff in some very significant ways. So, quick pause right here. We're going to come back to the next video and discuss how we can essentially solve all these issues in some really nice fashion. So I'll see you in just a minute. Now that we understand what is going wrong inside of our project, let's talk about the absolute distinct steps that we're going to undergo to actually fix each of these issues. So here's the idea. Right now, we've got a lot of unreusable code inside of our index.js file. We're going to start to refactor this into two separate files. Inside of our index.js file, we're going to have some not reusable code, so code that is very specific for our project. Examples of code that is specific to our project is the process of fetching movies, or the process of deciding what an individual movie should look like inside the autocomplete, and the code related to deciding what to do when an option is clicked on. Then we're going to have a second file called autocomplete.js. Inside there, we're going to have some extremely reusable code that is all related to getting an autocomplete to display on the screen successfully. That file should be 100% reusable between different projects. And so because of that, we need to make sure that everything inside that file has zero knowledge of exactly what a movie is, or what a recipe is if we were building something around showing recipes, or what a blog is, and so on. In addition, we want to make sure that the code in this file can be executed several times successfully. The idea there being that we want to have the ability to show several different autocompletes on the screen at the same time, without having to do that crazy renaming of variables or anything like that. So to make this happen, we're going to create a function inside of autocomplete.js that's going to take a configuration object. It's going to process the options inside that configuration object and then render an autocomplete out onto the screen. So inside of that configuration object that's going to be created inside of index.js, we're going to have to provide all the code that is like customized for the very specific application of this autocomplete. So let me tell you about what our config object might look like. I think that our config object is going to have three different properties inside of it. It's going to have a function that is used to find movies, a function that is used to render out an individual option inside the autocomplete, a function that says exactly what to do when a user clicks on an option, and finally, an element that designates exactly where the autocomplete should be rendered to inside of our final HTML document. So because we are passing these four very critical options inside of a config object, that object right there is essentially wrapping up all the customized code specific to our application. And it's going to pass it off to autocomplete.js. Autocomplete.js is then going to call some of those very specific functions whenever it needs to, say, get some data, or decide how to render out each option, or what to do whenever a user clicks on an option. So in other words, all the not reusable code gets defined inside of index.js, and all the reusable code is inside of autocomplete.js. Then if we ever want to reuse all this stuff on another project, we're going to take autocomplete.js, add it to the new project, come up with a new config object that has the exact same options inside of it, and pass it into the same function. So that's the idea. That's how we're going to make our code reusable. Now, if I am explaining this right now and it makes zero sense, that is totally okay and really very much expected. I really do not expect you to look at this diagram and know exactly what is going on right away. This is just your first taste of what we're going to be doing and how we're going to make all this code reusable in nature. So now that we have a vague idea of what we're going to do, let's take another pause right here. We're going to come back to the next video. We're going to start to create these two separate files and then split apart all of our code into these separate different implementations. So I'll see you in just a minute. Now that we have a better idea of how we're going to make our code more reusable, let's start writing out some code. Now, understanding this entire flow from the get-go is kind of challenging. So rather than trying to do this entire refactor all at once, we're going to set ourselves a little bit more immediate goal. We're going to try to say that rather than defining all these different options right away inside of some config object, we're just going to try to pass in some root element. So this is going to be some element that the autocomplete should be rendered into. So the immediate goal that we're going to focus on is just having the ability to show multiple different autocompletes on the screen at the same time. So we should be able to create multiple different config objects and pass each of them into some autocomplete function. The autocomplete function should then create the autocomplete in those different root elements. So again, that's the immediate goal. That's what we're going to try to do from the get-go. So to get started, I'm going to first go back over to my editor. Inside of my root project directory, I'll create a new file called autocomplete.js. Inside of here, I'm going to define a function called createAutoComplete. So we're going to call this function multiple different times, and eventually it's going to have a bunch of reusable code inside of it. Whenever we call this function, we're going to pass in some kind of configuration object. And that config object is going to have all the kind of custom functions that specify how the autocomplete should work inside of our specific application. So that config object is essentially where we put all of our references to movies and how the movie should be rendered and what to do when one gets clicked and so on. I'm then going to make sure that I wire up that autocomplete.js file inside of my index.html file. So inside of here, I'll go down to the very bottom. I'm going to duplicate one of the script tags and then change the src to autocomplete. So now that file will actually be executed. Do make sure that you've got utils and then autocomplete and then index.js. If index.js is listed first, then the code inside there will run first, and it will try to call the autocomplete function before it has been created. Okay, so I'll save that file. Then we're going to start to do the big refactor. So the big refactor, we're going to go into index.js, and I'm going to take as much of the autocomplete related code as possible that is supposed to be reusable in nature and move it over to the autocomplete.js file. So that's going to start from about line 16 or so, where I have const root right there. I'm going to go from that line and I'm going to select everything down to the end of document add event listener. So that's about line 65 or so for me. I'm then going to cut all of that, go over to autocomplete.js, and paste it into the function. Okay, so now all we have to do is start to repair the code inside of here. We're going to make sure that some of the stuff that is application specific is being taken from this config object instead of being placed directly inside this file. So the first and best example of that is going to be the root element right here. Normally when all this code runs, it assumes that our document is going to have a div or some other element with a class of autocomplete. If that were the case, then we would only be able to call create autocomplete exactly one time, because there's probably only one element that we're going to be able to select with this statement. So instead of trying to figure out what element we should be rendering into inside of this reusable function, we're going to instead accept this as a configurable property. So we're going to make sure that our config object has a root property, and that's going to be the element that the autocomplete should be rendered into. So in other words, this config object right there, I'm going to expect to have a root element. So I'm going to destructure out a property called root like so. Make sure you get those curly braces because we are destructuring that property out. So now because this is being provided as an option, the create autocomplete function no longer on its own has to figure out where to render the autocomplete. So we can now delete that first statement right there. All right, one or two other quick changes inside of here. On lines 12 or 14 or so, where we've got all those different references to input, dropdown, and so on. Those are trying to find just some input in the document or some element with the class of dropdown and so on. We don't want that to be the case. Instead, we want to try to find the input, the dropdown, and results that are inside of that root element. In other words, that one right there, that input, and that results element as well. So to make sure that we get those elements, we can update the query selector right here. Instead of looking at the entire document, we're going to look specifically inside of the root element. So root, root, and root. All right, that's probably just about everything we have to do inside of create autocomplete for right now. So now we can go back over to our index.js file, and we're going to try to call create autocomplete multiple different times. Every single time, we're going to form up a different configuration object that has a different root element to render the autocomplete into. So back inside of index.js, I'm going to call create autocomplete, and I'll pass in my configuration object. So this thing is going to have a root element. Let's first go back over to our index.html file and make sure that there are different elements so we can render these separate autocompletes into. Inside of index.html, right now we've got that one div with the class of autocomplete. I'm going to duplicate that down twice. So I'm going to try to render 3 different autocompletes into my application. One into that one, and that one. I need to make sure that I give them class names just to make sure that they are easier to select. So on the second one, I'll do autocomplete-2 and autocomplete-3, like so. We'll eventually get some better class names than this, but for right now, that's good enough for testing purposes. So finally, we can go back over to index.js, and I'm going to say that I want to create one instance of an autocomplete widget at a root element of document.querySelector.autocomplete. And then I'm going to duplicate this down twice, so 1 and 2, and I'll change the query selectors for those 2 other divs that we just added in. So the second one right there is going to get autocomplete-2, so autocomplete-2, and then -3. And that should be it. Okay, so let's save this, we'll test it, and then do a quick wrap up on the changes we made. So go back over, refresh, and now I see the 3 different inputs. I'll first go down to the bottom one. I'll search for Avengers. There we go, and I can click it and select it, and it gets selected on the screen. I'll then go to the second one. I'll try searching for Dark Knight. Yep, that one works as well. That one gets selected on the screen. Now, why is it getting selected here? Well, remember, right now, our create autocomplete function has a reference to just one single element to show the output in. It's that summary right there inside of onMovieSelect. So that is the only location right now where we can render some output to whenever a user clicks on an element. And that's why we're seeing essentially the same summary element being overwritten every single time that we click on a movie. So obviously that's something that's definitely going to eventually have to be fixed up. But again, for right now, we were just worried about trying to make sure that we could show the same root element, or show the same autocomplete in different root elements. So finally, one more test here on the first one. I'll look for Avengers, click it, and that works as well. Okay, so that's pretty much it. We can now clearly show multiple different autocomplete widgets on the screen, whereas before, we definitely could only show one at a time. So the big summary here, and the process that we're going to start to duplicate again and again in the next couple of videos as we continue this refactor, is that we are trying to be able to create multiple different autocompletes, and we're going to centralize all the logic around creating each one inside of index.js. And inside of autocomplete.js, we're going to have just the logic inside of here that is reusable between different projects. So it will not have any references to movies. It will have no idea what a movie object is. It will have no idea the different properties it has, and so on. Okay, so let's take a pause right here and continue our refactor in the next video. Our first test worked out pretty well, so let's continue on with this refactor. I'm inside of my index.js file. Inside of here, we've got the 3 create autocomplete function calls in a row. we don't really need 3 different autocompletes. I just did that for testing purposes. So I'm going to delete the 2 right there, and we're going to go back to just one call to create autocomplete. I'm also going to go to my index.html file and remove those 2 extra divs. All right, so let's continue on with this refactor. I want to continue to add in some additional functions to that config object that we're passing to the create autocomplete function. We're then going to refactor the function to make sure that it uses the functions we had provided instead of locating all that logic directly inside of the create autocomplete function. So I think the next one we should try working on is render option. So this is going to be a function that is going to be called with each different option or each kind of object that we're getting back from that API. We're going to pass it into this function, and that function needs to return some kind of string that's going to be the HTML that shows up inside of the dropdown. So in short, if we go back over to autocomplete.js, here's create autocomplete, and if we go down to our for of loop, right now, right about here, essentially, where we're setting the inner HTML of the option, remember we had said that this is assuming 100% that we always want to show an image and then the title right next to it. But we might decide that we want our autocomplete to work in some very different way. Like, for example, maybe we won't have an image at all. So right now, this would be really challenging to customize because this is code that is located inside of our autocomplete file, which we want to be as reusable as possible. So instead, I want to extract the logic that decides what this thing looks like to a helper function on that config object. We're going to assume that that helper function is going to be called with each movie object that we are iterating over. Now, I know you see the variable movie inside of here quite a bit still, and like I'm still using the term movie. We are going to eventually refactor the terminology inside of here to not refer to movie anymore. I just want to throw that out there really quickly. Okay, so back inside of our index.js file, I'm going to find where we create the autocomplete. I'm going to pass in a second property into this object. I'm going to call it render option. We could make this a function like so. We could also assign it as an arrow function. No difference whatsoever. We can really use either syntax. So passed into this function, I'm going to expect to receive some object, like each individual object that represents some possible movie or whatever else. And I'll just refer to it as movie. So then inside, we're going to generate some HTML and return it. And this will be the HTML that gets shown for each individual option. So we're going to have to extract all the logic we had around that. It's not only the HTML right there, we also have to extract that line where we got the image src. Because remember, in some cases, the poster link was NA, and we needed to make sure we handled that as well. So I'm going to take the image src line right there. I'm going to cut it. I'm going to go paste it back inside of render option. I'll then go and get the inner HTML that we had created right here. I'm going to cut it. Go back over to render option. I'll paste it in here and return it. So now we've extracted all of our rendering logic into this render option function, and it's going to be called many times automatically with each movie that the autocomplete fetches. So now we just need to make sure that the create autocomplete function references this function to figure out what each option should look like. So to do so, we'll go back over to the other file. I'm going to go up to the very top. And we're going to make sure that we destructure off the render option function. Then we'll go back down to that same for of loop. Here it is right here. I'll find where I left the option inner HTML. So to generate the HTML to show for this option, we're going to call render option with the movie that we are currently iterating over. And there we go. So now, once again, we've extracted some custom logic that is only appropriate for this movie-related stuff. And if we ever decide that we want the autocomplete to look very different, so if we want to generate some HTML for each individual option, we only have to update the render option function back inside of index.js. So I'll now save this and do a quick test. Back over here, I'll refresh. I'll look for Avengers, and I still see the same thing. Let's try making a change to the render option function just to see how easy it is now to make a change and get something that looks slightly different. As a quick reminder, inside of the data that we get back from our API, it contains the year that the movie was created. So let's try printing out the year that the movie was created next to each option as well. So to do so, I no longer, this is the entire key right here. This is the part to listen to, in other words. I no longer have to go hunting through and searching through all the source code of the create autocomplete function to figure out how to change what each individual item looks like. Instead, I can look at my render option function right here, which is very appropriately named. If I see that name, chances are I would think to myself, oh, this is where we decide how to change what each individual option looks like. So then inside of here, right after the movie title, I could put down maybe a set of parentheses, and then inside there print out, using $ and curly brace, movie.year. So we can save that, go back over, refresh, look for Avengers again, and now I see the year on there. So hopefully this change is a little bit more meaningful when we start talking about all this refactoring and kind of reusable logic stuff. It is the presence of this function right here that will make it really clear to other engineers how to customize and get some version of the autocomplete that works for their particular application. I'm sure you can imagine that if we wanted to make even more changes to how each individual option looks, we would just make some more changes to render option, and that's it. Okay, so hopefully now you're starting to get a little bit more sense of the purpose of this whole refactor. So let's take a quick pause right here and continue in the next video. The next refactor we're going to do is for onOptionSelect. So in other words, we're going to pull out all the logic that decides what function to run whenever a user clicks on an option. So to do so, I'm going to go back over to autocomplete.js, and we're going to find inside of here the code responsible for doing something whenever a user clicks on an option. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit inside of onInput. Inside of there is our for/of loop once again. And then inside of there, after we create our option, we attach that event listener. So this right here, this function, is what's going to run after a user clicks on an individual option. Now, something to be aware of inside of here. The first line, like removing that isActive class, that's something that we want to have happen irregardless of what goes on. In other words, no matter what, whenever a user clicks on an option, we always want to close the dropdown. So we don't want to just kind of extract that function right there somewhere else. Instead, we only want to extract some parts of it. I think one part that we very definitely, probably very clearly want to extract would be onMovieSelect right here, because that is what actually decides what really happens or what goes on whenever a user clicks on the button. But the line that is kind of questionable about whether we need to extract or not is where we set the input's value with the movie title. Half of this line, in other words, that half right there, is very much appropriate for keeping inside of this autocomplete file because it is related to how the autocomplete works. And we probably want it to work the same way, regardless of whether we're showing movies or recipes or blog posts or whatever else. But the source of it, in other words, movie.title, that part of that line or that expression is very much customized for the type of resource we're working with. If we weren't working with movies, then instead this line should probably be something like blog name or something like that, or recipe name. But in every scenario, we definitely want to take whatever that value is and throw it back into the input value. So this is kind of a more challenging refactor, and we're going to have to think about exactly how to handle that. For right now, it's probably pretty obvious that we definitely want to extract the callback right there. So at very minimum, let's make sure that we create and pass in some function called onOptionSelect on our config object. And inside there, we'll make sure that we call onMovieSelect. So back inside of index.js, here's create autocomplete. I'm going to pass in another function called onOptionSelect. I'm going to expect that this is going to be called with whatever object that the user just clicked on, and I'm going to call it movie. So then inside of here, we can do the same exact thing that we did before, where we call onMovieSelect. So I'll call onMovieSelect and pass through the movie. So then we can go back over to autocomplete.js. At the very top, once again, we can destructure off that new function, which we called onOptionSelect. And then back down at the event listener that we were just looking at, instead of calling onMovieSelect right there directly, instead it will be onOptionSelect. Now this might seem like a very insignificant change right here, right? We just changed the name of the dropdown or the callback function. Who cares? Again, the entire point here is that if we had some scenario where we wanted to call a different function right there, if we were using our autocomplete on another application, we would have had to open up the source code for our autocomplete and change that line of code, which 100% not good. We don't want to have to edit the source code of autocomplete.js. So in doing this change, we've extracted deciding what to do when a user clicks on something into this configuration option over in index.js, which is going to contain all of our application-specific code. So I know this seems like a smaller change, but it still is pretty meaningful. Okay, so now the other thing we need to be aware of that we discussed, this line right here. So again, the left-hand side, it needs to happen for every instance in which we use an autocomplete. But the source of information is really, well, that's kind of application-specific. So I think that we need to pass in another helper function to our config object. And I think that we need to use that to decide exactly what value to assign when a user clicks on something. So back inside of index.js, I'm going to add in another helper function. I'm going to call it input value. The goal of input value is going to be to take a movie, and after a user clicks on the option, we're going to call input value with the movie, and we're going to return whatever value should show up inside of the input. So I'm going to return movie.title. So this is how we're going to extract the logic out of autocomplete.js. So now to use that, we'll go back over to autocomplete.js again. Rather than directly referencing movie.title, I will instead call input value with the movie up inside of our config object up here at the very top of the file. I'll make sure that I also extract input value from the config object. All right. Now, one last thing I want to repeat really quickly here. We still have many references to movie inside this file, and so it might seem like we're making no progress in actually making this thing reusable. Again, we are going to eventually come back through and replace the term movie with something else. That will be a little bit more consistent. Okay, so we got one more step forward. Let's do another test. I'll refresh. I'll search for Avengers. I'll click, and it looks like the input value still gets updated correctly. Okay, so that's very good. Let's now take one more pause and try to finish up this refactor in the next video. The last thing we need to extract is fetch data. So fetch data is being used inside of our autocomplete.js file right now directly. So if we go to autocomplete.js, find our onInput callback right here, we're calling fetch data. When we call fetch data right here, that is a reference back to the fetch data that gets defined inside of index.js. So this means that we have a direct link between these two files. Autocomplete.js is directly referencing this function right here. So if we ever deleted this function or renamed it or even just commented it out, our autocomplete would no longer work correctly. So we definitely do not want to have such a tight coupling between these two functions. So we're just going to essentially take this function right here, and we're going to throw it as another argument or another option into our create autocomplete config object. We're then going to update our autocomplete file and make sure that it references the fetch data that is passed on that config object instead of over this like direct global scope between the two files. So to do so, I'm going to take just the function. I'm going to cut it. I'll delete the function name at the very top. I'm going to add in a new key value pair to my configuration object. I'll call it fetch data. I'm going to put a set of parentheses and then paste the function. Now, I definitely have some mistakes on syntax inside of here, so I'm going to make sure that I fix those up. First off, we need to make sure that we mark fetch data as being async. So I'm going to delete the async keyword right there and put it right in front of fetch data. I'll then make sure that I take the search term and add it as the argument to fetch data. And then finally, I can remove the fetch data right there and the arrow, and it should be good to go. So make sure you triple check your syntax right there, because definitely very easy to make a little typo. I'm also going to do a quick change or fix to the syntax or indentation. There we go. Okay, so now we are passing the fetch data function as an argument into our create autocomplete configuration object. So now if we go back over to autocomplete.js, at the very top, once again, we will destructure out the fetch data function. So now there is no direct kind of window scope access between these two different files, which is definitely a good improvement. All right, so I think there's just one last thing for us to take care of. We need to go through our autocomplete.js file and we need to find any reference to a movie. In order to actually make this code generic in nature and reusable, we need to not make any big assumptions about the kind of data that we are working with. So we just have to go through and change the words movie or movies to some other kind of appropriate term. So inside of here, I first see movie on our label. It says search for a movie. I'm just going to change this to just say search. I'll then go down a little bit. So inside of on input, after we made our request, we called what came back movies. So again, not appropriate to have the term movies inside of autocomplete.js anymore. So I'm going to change the term movies throughout this file to items. So this kind of reflects that we have a collection of different items that we want to show inside that dropdown. So now we can go through and update every reference to movies to items instead. So the first one is inside the if statement. I'll change that to items. The next one is right here on the for loop. I'll change that to items. And I think that is about it inside of here. Let me do one more search. Yep, that's it. So now inside of the for loop itself, we'll change the term movie to item singular. So on the for loop, I'll do item. On render option, I'll change it to item. Input value right here, I'll change it to item. On option select, we'll go to item. And I think that is just about it. We'll do a search for movie and nothing. So make sure inside of autocomplete.js, you do a search for movie. And if you see the word movie inside of here, that is wrong. We should not have any references to movies anymore. All right, and that's pretty much it. Let's save this and think we're ready for one last test. So I'm going to go back over to my index.html. I'll refresh. I'll search for Avengers again, and everything works correctly. The search occurred, and I should be able to click on that and still see something appear. If you see any errors inside of your console, I can just about guarantee you that you still have a reference to movie or movies somewhere inside of autocomplete.js. So make sure that you find that remaining reference and update it to the appropriate term. Okay, so at this point in time, we now have a fully reusable function called createAutoComplete. We can take this function right here, and we can use it on any other project we can think of, and we'll get the exact same behavior as the one that we currently have inside of our application. All we have to do is call the function and pass in these appropriate different properties. So we need to specify where to render the autocomplete to, how to show an individual item, what to do when someone clicks on one, what to kind of backfill inside of the input after a user clicks on one, and then how to actually fetch the data. As long as we put all that code inside there, then we're going to get a fully functioning autocomplete ready to go. So I know this last bit of the refactor was a little bit of a pain, but I hope that at this point it's a little bit more clear why we went through this pain, and I hope you can recognize that the code that we now have is quite reusable in nature. So let's take a pause right here and continue with our application in the next video. Just to make sure it's really clear why this refactor was so significant, I want to show you how quickly we could change some of the code inside these different options we're passing in and get an autocomplete that works with a very different source of data. So just as a quick example, you don't have to change your code here because I'm going to change my code right back. Again, this is a very quick example. I'm going to go to jsonplaceholder.typeicode.com. This is a fake API that can be used for testing purposes and just generally kind of messing around. If I scroll down a little bit, I can find a section called Resources, and inside there is an endpoint that will serve me up a photos collection. Inside there is 5,000 different photos. So I encourage you not to click that link because it's going to load up a ton of data and might make your browser hang. Nonetheless, I'm going to go ahead and do it myself. So if I click on it after a second or so, I will see that if I make a request to this endpoint, I'll get back an array of objects, where each object represents one photo. Each photo has a title and a thumbnail URL. I'm going to try to make a request and get just 50 of these photos inside of my code, and I'm going to try to render each of them into that autocomplete that we just put together. If I want to only get 50 photos instead of the 5,000 that it just fetched, I could add on to the URL album ID equals 1. And that will give me only the first 50 photos inside of here. So if I scroll down, I'll see that I only get 50 photos total. Okay, so to change my autocomplete to work with this source of data instead, I would take this URL, and again, you don't have to make these changes. I'm going to change my code back very quickly. This is just a fast demonstration. I would then go and update my fetch data function. So instead of making a request to the OMDB API, I'm going to instead just paste that URL in directly. So /photos album ID equals 1. These params are technically not going to be used, but I can still just leave them in here. The request is still going to work. Actually, I'll take them out just to be sure, just to make sure it's really clear. So I'll take those out. I'll then make sure that when I get the response, there is no longer a search property. So I'll take out the .search. So this should work correctly to fetch the data. Now all we would have to do is make sure that we update how each of these gets rendered. That is controlled inside of render option right here. So instead of the current code I have, I would instead say maybe just return an image element with the source of movie dot, and let me double check the name of the actual image, thumbnail URL. And then I'll do the title, which is title. So movie dot title. Notice I'm still calling this argument movie. It now technically is like an image object, but it's just not a good use of time to change the variable name. Okay, so now I can save this, flip back over, refresh, and now I should be able to just type anything inside of here. Technically, there's no longer any searching operation going on, and I'll see this very different source of data being used. So now I've got each thumbnail, which is the colored squares you see, along with the title of each image showing up next to it. And I've got all 50 being rendered out right now. So that's pretty much it. That's all we would have to do to make a significant change to the autocomplete. We just go back to these functions that we understand exactly what they do perfectly. You know, this one fetches data, this one controls how each option gets rendered, make those very few changes, and that's it. We now have a widget that works in a totally different context. Okay, so that's just all I wanted to show you. I'm going to very quickly undo the changes I just made and go back to working with movies. And there we go. So now I'll do a quick test just to make sure I'm back, and still works with movies. Cool. So again, just a quick examination of how we would change things out. So let's take another pause here, continue the app in the next video. Our autocomplete widget is working out pretty well. So now the last thing I want to do is to actually go back to the original application that we're working on. We need to make sure that we essentially have two different autocompletes being displayed, and they need to kind of show up next to each other in like two separate columns. We should also make sure that when the user first loads up the app, we show some kind of tutorial message on the screen as well and tell them exactly what to do. So in this video, we're going to change our HTML structure a little bit to make sure that we get these two different columns and that tutorial message. So we're going to do a lot of typing inside of our index.html file. So I'm going to open that up right away. Once again, a lot of the different classes that we're going to add in here are taken directly from the Bulma CSS library. We're not going to focus too much on the class names or the styling because, again, class about JavaScript. That's what we're here for. Okay, so let's get to it. Inside of here, I'm going to first begin by deleting the two elements we have inside of class container. So we're going to essentially just rewrite all the structure we have. Inside of class container, I'm then going to create a class or a div with class of columns. Inside there, I'm going to do a div with the class of column. Notice there's no S on there. The one before had an S, this one doesn't. Inside of this one, I'm going to show a div with an ID of left-autocomplete. So as you would guess, we're going to eventually use this as the root element for the autocomplete that we're going to show on the left-hand side. I'm using a div here just to 100% identify this thing as a very unique element inside of my application. And I only ever want to have one with that ID. Okay, I'm going to close off the div with class column right there. And then after it, I'm going to put another div with the class of column. And inside there, I'll do another div with an ID of right-autocomplete. And I'll close it off. Okay, so that's a good place to get started. Now finally, after the div with class columns, the closing element for that, or the closing tag, is right there. So I'm going to find the closing tag for the class columns, and after it, I'm going to put in some markup to show a tutorial of sorts to the user. So I'm going to do a div with a class, couple class names here. So we're going to have column is-half notification, there we go, is-primary, and tutorial. I'll close off that div, and we're going to show some message to the user inside of here so they understand how to use our application. So I'll do an h1 with the class of title, and I'll say something like search for a movie on both sides. And then after that, I'll do a paragraph element with the class of subtitle with some text like, we will tell you which is best. Again, just to help our user understand what's going on here. Now, two things here. Please double check your spelling of the word notification. Very easy to misspell. In addition, overall, just do a double check of all the HTML that we just wrote, because very easy to make several typos inside of here. Make sure you've got columns, and then column, column, and column down there as well. Okay, so I'm going to save this. Now, we're not going to see any autocompletes appear right away because we removed the div with the class of autocomplete. So in fact, we're probably going to get a JavaScript error. I just want to do a quick refresh and make sure that we see the tutorial on the screen. That's what I really want to see right now. So I'm going to go back over. I'm going to refresh, and yep, I definitely see that appear. So now we can go back and we can start to wire up the two different autocompletes that we want to have, one that's going to be rendered into right there and the other to right there. So quick pause, and we're going to make sure that we render both these autocompletes in the next video. All right, now that we've got this better HTML structure, we're going to go back over to our index.js file and make sure that we show two separate autocompletes. One that's going to use left autocomplete as a root, the other is going to use right autocomplete as a root. So back inside of my index.js file, at the very top, we are calling createAutoComplete, and we're passing in a reference to a div with the class of autocomplete, which doesn't exist anymore. So I'm going to change that query selector to pound right dash, actually let's do left first, left dash autocomplete. I'll go ahead and save this. So now if we flip back over and refresh, we see one autocomplete on the left-hand side. So now we need to essentially do the exact same thing to create the autocomplete on the right-hand side as well. So you might be thinking that that means that we essentially have to duplicate all of this code right here just to have a second call to create autocomplete with a different root. We don't have to. We don't have to duplicate all of this config. So let me show you what we're going to do. At the very top of the file, I'm going to create a new variable called autocomplete config. And I'll make it an object. Then we're going to go into our current autocomplete config, so like this object right here, and we're going to take out every option inside of here, so every key value property, every function that is reusable between our two different autocompletes that we want to show. Well, if we look through here, every single function inside is reusable except for the root element. Maybe we'll go down the line and realize that it's not 100% reusable, but for right now, I think that we definitely can reuse just about everything except for that root element. So I'm going to take render option. I'll go down to the bottom of fetch data. I'm going to highlight all that. I'm going to cut all of it. So now the only thing that's left is root. And I'm going to paste all of it inside of autocomplete config, like so. Okay, so now inside of the create autocomplete function call right here, we're going to essentially say create a new object, take all of the properties inside of autocomplete config that we defined at the top of the file, and then add in this new property of root, and then take that whole object and pass it off to create autocomplete. So to do so, we're going to write out inside of here autocomplete config, and then a comma. So the ... right there means make a copy of everything inside that object, or essentially take all the different functions inside there and throw them into this object. And then add in this root property as well, and that's it. So what we have right here is 100% equivalent to what we had just before. But now, since autocomplete config is its own separate object, we can repeat this process as many times as we want and create additional autocompletes with the same configuration object. So to do so, I'm going to make a copy of create autocomplete config, or create autocomplete, just the function call. I'll paste it. Now all we have to do is update the query selector. So instead of saying left, I'm going to say right. Okay, and that's pretty much it. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to go back over, refresh, and now I see the two separate autocompletes. I'm going to make sure I don't have any errors. Nope, nothing inside my console. Now if I do a search for Avengers, looks like the left-hand side is working. And if I do a search for Dark Knight on the right, yep, that's working as well. I can click that. Avengers, click that. Yep, looks good. Now, if I click on those, I probably am going to see an error down here because we deleted the element that showed the actual summary, you'll recall, just a second ago when we were updating the HTML file. So I think that the next obvious thing we have to do is make sure that once we search for something, we need to hide this kind of tutorial element right here and show a summary on just the appropriate side of the screen. So let's take care of that process in the next video. The next thing we have to do is to make sure that whenever we click on a video inside of our autocomplete, we should hide this tutorial right here and start to show some summary information about that movie on the appropriate side, either the left side or the right side. So let's first take care of making sure that we just hide this thing. To do so, I'm going to go back over. I'm going to go up into my config object, and I'm going to find where we have the callback of onOptionSelect. Here it is right here. So I'm going to replace onOptionSelect, or excuse me, I'm going to add to the code inside of it. I'm going to get a selector for that kind of tutorial window that we just added in. So inside my HTML file, here it is right here. So I'm going to get a selector for a div with the class of tutorial, and then we're going to add a class to it that's going to hide that thing on the screen. So inside of onOptionSelect, I'll do a document query selector with .tutorial. I'm going to look at its class list, and I'm going to add in a class of is-hidden, like so. This is another one of those classes that is coming from the Bulma CSS framework. So by just adding on that class, that div that is containing the tutorial should be hidden on the screen. Let's do a save and a quick test. So I'll flip back over, refresh, look for Avengers, click, and the thing is gone. Okay, well, that was an easy one. Another quick pause right here, and we'll continue with showing the two tutorials on both sides in just a moment. All right, last thing we really have to do here is to make sure that when a user selects one of those movies, we show a summary on the appropriate side of the screen. So the first thing we have to do is to make sure that we have some div elements to render the summaries into. Remember, at the bottom of the index.js file, we still have the movie template function. So we essentially know what content we want to show, we just need to make sure that we have some place to put it. So inside of index.html, I'm going to find where my div of left autocomplete is, and right after it, I'm going to add in a div with an ID of left-summary and close it off. And then I'll do the same thing right after the right autocomplete as well. So a div with an ID of right-summary, like so. So now all we need to do is to make sure that whenever onMovieSelect gets called, we render the summary into the appropriate element, either the left side or the right side. So to make this happen, we're probably going to have two versions of either onMovieSelect or two versions of onOptionSelect up here. Remember, right now we're using the same version of onOptionSelect between both the left-hand side autocomplete and the right-hand side. So I think that we should probably take onOptionSelect and then throw it down into each individual call to create autocomplete, and that will allow us to make a customized version for each one. So to do so, I'm going to go up to my autocomplete config. I'm going to cut onOptionSelect out. I'll then go down to my calls to create autocomplete 1 and 2, and I'm going to paste that thing in. So paste and paste. And I'll make sure that I get a comma on the line right above. Otherwise, I'll see an error very quickly. So now this one right here is for the left-hand side, and this one right here is the right-hand side. So to make sure that we actually render the summary into the appropriate element, let's make sure that when we call onMovieSelect in both cases, as a second element, I'm going to pass in a reference to an element of where to render the summary to. So on the first one, which is responsible for the left-hand side, I'll get a document query selector for pound left-summary. And I'll do the same thing for the second one as well. Document.query selector pound right-summary. So now inside of onMovieSelect, we can receive that second argument. So in addition to movie, we'll receive that other argument as like, how about summary target or something like that? How about summary element? I think that makes sense. So then we're going to do that request to get more details about the selected movie. And then instead of throwing the rendered template inside of some summary element that doesn't exist anymore. Instead, we're going to throw it into the inner HTML of that summary element. So I'm going to replace that query selector with summary element. Okay, so let's save this and do a quick test. Go back over. I'll look for Avengers once again for the millionth time. Click it, and there's my summary on the left-hand side, and I should be able to do dark night. Click it, and see the summary on the right-hand side. Now I should be able to go between both these and just make sure that they've got the appropriate values, or I should just say different values, to make sure that we're not accidentally leaking data from like one side to another. So I'm looking through, and yep, it all looks good. Okay, so now the very last thing we have to do here to really complete our application, remember the last requirement of our project was to compare both the different stats. And we need to make sure that we color the greater stat on each side of the screen. This is going to be a little bit more challenging than it seems because in some cases, comparing these things is actually kind of challenging. For example, how do we really compare this string right here with this string? How do we compare this number right here? This is a string when it comes back from the API. We know it's a string because it has the $sign and the commas in there. So how do we compare that string versus that string? It's pretty clear, I think, that we're going to have to figure out some ways to really compare these different statistics, and in some cases, it might require some special logic. So one last pause, and we're going to figure that stuff out in the next video. The last thing we have to do is make sure that we get a comparison going between all these different stats. So back inside of my index.js file, I'm going to find where we were just working on movie select. We're going to eventually do a request inside of here, remember, to get some follow-up details about a particular movie. Now, one thing we should probably do inside of here is get a reference or store a reference to that response that comes back. So we can hold on to that reference to that movie in all those different statistics so we can do an easy comparison later on. So right above on movie select, I'm going to define two variables with the let keyword. So I'll say let left movie and right movie. Then inside this function, after we get some data back from Axios, let's make sure that we store the movie that we just fetched on the appropriate variable. To do so, we're going to need to make sure that we pass in some additional argument here to indicate whether we are receiving the movie on the left side or the right side. So inside of both the functions where we call onMovieSelect, I'm going to pass in one last variable here of left as a string and right as a string. So now we know the context in which onMovieSelect is being called. So inside of here, I'm going to receive that as a variable that I'll call simply side. And then right after we set that inner HTML, we can say something like if side equals left, then let's update the left movie variable. So I'll say left movie is response.data. Else, we must be working with the right side. So I'll say right movie is response.data. Then after we update both those variables, we should add in a check to see if both the left movie and right movie are defined. If both these variables are defined, that means we have a movie on both sides of the screen, and it's time to run the comparison. So after those if-else statements, I'll say if left movie and right movie, then let's run the comparison. I'm going to stick all the code for doing the comparison into a helper function called appropriately named run comparison. And I'll define that as a helper function right after. So then inside of here, we can iterate through our two different movies, run all the comparisons, and then update the appropriate statistics on both sides of the screen. So inside of here, I'm just going to do a quick console log for right now and say time for comparison, just to make sure that we are running this code at the appropriate time. I'll then go back over, refresh, get that console open, and then I'll do Avengers, there we go, and Dark Knight. And after I click this movie, it would then be, in theory, time to run the comparison. So I'd expect to see the console log appear at that time. So I'll click there, and I do in fact see time for comparison. Okay, so it looks like we're off to a good start. So now another quick pause, we'll come back in the next video and figure out how we're going to actually compare all these different statistics. All right, so in this video, we're going to implement our run comparison function. Now, as I mentioned just a moment ago, implementing this function is going to be just a little bit challenging because the metrics that we're comparing here aren't always just plain numbers. In this case, we've got some strings. So we need to figure out how to compare these different values. But there's actually another reason that this is kind of a challenging little problem. Let me tell you exactly why. I want you to think about the exact logic or kind of ordering in which we would run the comparison inside this function. The first statistic that we print out down here is the number of awards, or that whole award string, and then the box office, and then the Metascore. So it's clear that we need to somehow reach into the DOM. We need to select this element on both sides of the screen, because remember, there's really two of these elements on the screen, one for each movie we search for. So we need to find this first element, like the first element with the class of notification is primary and a article tag. And we're going to essentially assume that that is of type awards, or displaying the award stat. So we might end up running some code inside of here that looks like this. I'm just going to give you a very quick example. Maybe something like find the first article element for each movie, then run a comparison on the number of awards, then apply some styling to that article element. The key thing here is that we're just looking for the first article for each movie. Then we're assuming that that first article element represents the number of awards statistic. If we start to write some code like this, we're going to very quickly end up in a bad spot. Let me tell you why. If our code just looks at the first element and assumes it is awards, we could break our application super quickly by going back down to our template and just changing the order of statistics. So in other words, I could take this first statistic block, cut it, and move it underneath that first one, or the second one. So now the award statistic is second in the list. So if I ever wanted to reorder the different statistics that I'm showing here, I would also have to make an update to the run comparison function. Because now the first article in the list represents the box office amount. So I'd have to update this code to run a comparison on the box office value instead. And then it kind of follows that the second comparison, I would have to update from box office to instead take a look at number of awards. So in other words, we don't really want to encode the order of statistics here and try to read it out of our HTML to figure out what order we're going to compare these different statistics in. So that kind of throws that approach out the window. So how are we going to actually fix this? How are we going to actually approach it? Well, I've got one kind of crazy idea that's going to kind of solve a lot of the different issues that we're going to run into up front, particularly that other issue around comparing strings versus strings. I think that when we run the movie template function, we should add in a data property to each of these different articles. And we should make the data property a number version, like an easily comparable version of each of the different statistics that we want to show. So in other words, I think it would be awesome whenever we run movie template for each of these different articles, on the article itself, I want to put in a data value property and maybe set it to, for this first box office value, something like 623 million. So I'll say something like data value is 623 million or so. Then later on, when we decide to run our comparison, rather than trying to look at the order of articles and figure out that we first have box office, then awards, then Metascore, or whatever, we can just read that data value property and compare it against the data value property for the first article on the other side of the screen. So in other words, we're throwing the idea that this is the box office statistic out the window inside the run comparison function. The only thing run comparison will care about is that data value property. So we can just take a look at the data value property on each pair of articles and then take a look at which one is greater and apply the appropriate class to each one to color that notification as either green or yellow. Now this is yet another scenario where I know as I explain this, it probably sounds crazy and a little bit complicated. So let's once again write some code. As soon as we do, I think you'll get a good idea of why we're doing this. So quick pause and we'll start to implement this approach in the next video. All right, so like I said in this video, we're going to update our movie template function. We're going to take a look at some of the different properties inside that movie detail object. Remember, movie detail is an object with some expanded properties that describe a particular movie. For each of the different properties or statistics that we're printing out, we're going to turn each of these into some easy to represent number value. And then we're going to add each of them as a data property to each of these different articles. And so that will make it really easy to compare these different values later on without having to worry about the order in which they are being presented or anything like that. So inside of here, the first thing we're going to do at the top of the function is take a look at some of the different properties on movie detail and then turn them into a easy to compare number format. So this is unfortunately going to be just, once again, a little bit challenging. So the first number that we're going to try to generate is a number representation of the box office value. So I'm going to assign that to dollars because that's essentially how this is being represented. So I want to take a look at the box office value, which currently is like that string right there, number 623 with commas in it, or 533 with commas in it and whatnot. And I want to turn that into a normal integer that we can compare very easily. So back over inside of here, I'm going to say that dollars is movie detail dot box, capital B box office. So this right here is a string. And once again, it's going to look something like this, maybe 629, blah, blah, blah. So we want to remove the dollar sign, and we also want to remove any commas in there as well. So to do so, we can use some normal string manipulation methods. On box office, I'm going to call replace. I'm going to find any dollar sign character and replace it with an empty string, which essentially just removes it out of that string. Now, because I'm using a dollar sign inside of a regular expression right here, I do have to escape it. Remember what we spoke about earlier on inside the course about regular expressions. Dollar sign is a protected value, so we just have to put a kind of backslash right in front of it. So that's going to take the dollar sign out and just remove it entirely. Now we need to repeat that same step for all the commas in here as well. So I will once again call replace. I'm going to find all the commas and replace them with the empty string. That's going to take out all the commas. Now I just need to take this string and turn it into a number. To do so, I can call parse int on that entire expression. So that's going to parse an integer out of that string. Now as a quick test, as usual, I'll just try to do a console log of dollars. So I'll save that, flip back over, refresh. I'll look for Avengers, and I see a number version of 623 million appear. So now we're going to repeat that same process for all the different values on here. We're going to essentially run some custom logic on each of them to turn them into some number that we can insert for each article element and then compare later on. The next one we'll do is the Metascore. You might think that Metascore doesn't need any work whatsoever because it looks like it is a actual number. Well, if you go back to your network request log and look at the expanded detail requests that we're making, Metascore actually is a string. Just about everything inside of here is a string. So for every one of these different values, we need to parse them into a number and then throw them into the DOM. Metascore, IMDb rating, and IMDb votes all included. So the next one I'll do, I'm going to delete that console log, and I'll do Metascore. That's going to be parse int out of movie detail dot meta score. Next one I'll do is, how about IMDb rating? This one's a little bit more challenging. Notice how it can possibly have a decimal on it. So in JavaScript, there's a difference between parse int and another function called parse float. Parse int is going to prevent us from having a decimal. But if we use parse float, that can take a string that has a decimal on it or in it and turn that into a full number with a decimal. So for IMDb score, or is it called rating? Where is it? Yep, IMDb rating. We're going to do a parse float with movie detail dot IMDb rating. Then we can do the same thing for the number of votes as well. This one can use a parse int because there is no decimal on it. However, we do have to remove all the commas in there. So I'll do IMDb votes is parse int movie detail dot IMDb votes. Just going to double check that property name. Yep, that's it. And IMDb votes, we need to make sure that we go through that thing and replace any comma we see with an empty string. Okay, as another quick test, let's console log out Metascore, IMDb rating, and IMDb votes. So I'll save this, refresh. I'm going to once again look for the Avengers. I don't actually like the Avengers, by the way. I'm a way bigger DC fan, but I figure everybody out there probably knows what Avengers is. That's why I'm using it here. Just a quick side note. Okay, so we've got the numbers 69, 8, and blah, blah, blah. So it looks like we've got all of our values out of here appropriately. The last one we have to take care of is the actual value right there, the number of awards. Now, parsing a number out of here is going to be a little bit more challenging, so as usual, quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute. The last statistic we need to parse is the number of awards. So how are we going to reduce this down to something that can be easily compared between different movies? Well, we're just going to take all the different awards, or the total number of awards here. So we're going to find all the different numbers in here, add them all together, and we'll say whoever had the most numbers inside the statistic wins. So technically, one movie that has like one win but 100 nominations will beat out a movie with 10 wins. In theory, the movie with 10 wins and like 0 nominations would be better, but for our purposes, or the purposes of this application, we're just going to say whoever had the most numbers in this thing is the winner. So let's write out some code that's going to take a look at that string and extract the total number out of it. Back over here inside of movie template, I'm going to delete that comment up top. I'm going to delete the console log. And then we're going to declare a new variable called awards. So for this one, we'll take a look at movie detail. We're going to look at the awards property, which is that big long string. We're going to first begin by splitting it on space. This right here is going to give us an array where every element in the array is one of the different actual words or numbers in here. So essentially, all the spaces go away and just the element words we get inside of an array. So then we're going to iterate through that array, and we're going to say that for every actual number in there, we're going to keep some running total and then eventually return it. Now we're going to write this out in two different ways. We're going to write it out first with a for each, and then we're going to refactor it to use a reduce statement instead. This is a perfect location to do a reduce, but just as some quick practice, just to get familiar, because we're already doing some hard enough things here, we'll first do a for each. So right above, I'm going to declare a variable called count and start it off with 0. This is going to track the number of award values. So in this case, we would have like about, 118 for this movie right here. That's 1 plus 79 plus 38. Okay, so on split, remember that gives us an array. So I'll call for each. And then I'm going to take each word inside of that sentence. And I first need to see if I am working with a number or not. The first time that function gets called, it's going to receive the word nominated. That's obviously not a number. So to check to see if we're working with a number or not, we're going to first try to parse this thing. So I'll say value is parse int with word. If we try to parse an int on a string that doesn't contain any number whatsoever, we're going to get back a value of not a number. Let's do a quick test of that inside of our console over here very quickly, just to get a reminder of that behavior. So over here, I'll do a parse int of not a number, and I get back NaN, which again stands for not a number. So if I do parse int on, say, nominated, yep, we definitely get back not a number. So that's how we're going to tell if we're working with an actual number or not. Value is going to be not a number. So to check to see if we have a number or not, we will say if is NaN, like so. That's how we check to see if a value is not a number or not inside of JavaScript. That is a function that is built into the browser, so we don't need to define it or anything like that. So we're going to say if this value is not a number, then we're just going to stop. The return statement right here is just going to return from the inner function. So in other words, we're going to say don't try to add anything to count or anything like that. Otherwise, we'll do count is count plus value, like so. Okay, so now at the very end, I'll do a console.log of count, and we'll test this thing out for that first movie. I'll refresh, look up Avengers, click it, and there we go. I get the 118. So again, that is the 1 plus 38 plus 79. So we could stop there and just say, oh yeah, count is our variable. But instead, like I said, let's try to refactor this for each into a reduce statement instead, because this really is a perfect place to make use of reduce. So with reduce, remember, we're going to change the for each to reduce. Then the second argument to the reduce function, the first is the actual function we want to run. The second is going to be the starting value for our reduction. So in our case, our starting value is 0. Then the first argument to that inner function is going to be the previous value, and the second will be the word that we are currently iterating over. So then inside of this function body, we need to make sure that we return the next value for the next iteration through this loop. So right here in the return case, rather than just returning nothing, we're going to instead return previous. So if the value that we just are iterating over right here is not actually a number, then just return whatever our current count is. Otherwise, we're going to return the previous value that we got plus this new value. Okay, so now we can delete the let count up here. And just to make sure this works correctly again, I'm going to do a console log now of awards. I'll save that. Another quick test. So refresh, look up Avengers, click it, and I still get the 118. All right, so that is it. We've now extracted some meaningful values out of all these different statistics. So now the last thing we have to do is take these different values and inject them as data properties on each of these different articles. Once again, once we do that, we can then pull those values out later on when we decide that it is time to compare these different statistics. Okay, so quick pause right here, and we'll take care of that in the next video. All right, now that we've got all these statistics, let's make sure that we add each of them to the appropriate article elements inside of our template. So down here, I have my first article right there that is meant to show the number of awards. So on that article element, I'm going to add in a data value property, and I'm going to inject the value awards to it. Then we can repeat that same process for the other articles as well. So the next one is supposed to show box office. I think we called the relevant statistic dollars. Yeah, there it is right there. So I'm going to go back down. There's the box office statistic. On the article, I'll do a data value of dollars. The next one is a data value of Metascore. Then we've got our IMDb rating. So data-value of IMDb rating. And finally, data-value IMDb votes. And that should be it. Okay, as usual, we'll do a quick save and a test. So the test in this case is to inspect our DOM elements and just make sure that we are assigning some reasonable values to each one. So I will refresh. I'll look up Avengers. Whoops, I accidentally typed dollar instead of dollars, my mistake. There we go, dollars on the second one. Avengers again, click it, that's better. So now I can inspect my DOM. I'm going to look at each of these elements and just make sure that they have the appropriate value property. And there we go. So I can see the list of articles. There's the first one. It has a data value of 118. Then I've got the number value for the dollars, then the Metascore, the IMDb rating, and finally the number of votes. Okay, so that's pretty much it. We can now repeat that same process for the stuff on the right-hand side as well. So over here, I'll look up Dark Knight. I'll do an inspect of that element right there. And I get 309 awards. Wow, that's pretty crazy. Then I get the about 533 million, then 84 Metascore, and 9 IMDb rating, and finally 2 million votes. Okay, so that's it. So now the very last thing we have to do inside of our run comparison function right here, we can now iterate over all those different article elements. So we're going to iterate over both of them at the same time. Basically, get this collection on the left-hand side and this collection on the right-hand side. And then we'll compare each of them one by looking at their data-value properties. Whichever one is greater, we're going to apply some classes to color it as yellow. Otherwise, we'll leave it as is and just leave it green. Okay, so that's the idea. One more quick pause, and we're going to wrap this thing up in the next video. All right, let's get to it. Let's run our comparison on both sides. The first thing we have to do is select all these different articles, and we need to make sure that we keep the two different sets separate. As a quick reminder, if we open up our element inspector again, the entire summary on the left-hand side is enclosed inside of a div with an ID of left-summary. So if I want to get all the articles that have a statistic inside of there, I can select, so document query selector, ID left-summary. That's going to give me essentially the entire left side. And then I can find all of the elements inside there with a class of notification. So I'll do inside of that a query selector of .notification. Oh, I don't want to do a query selector. My mistake. I want to do a query selector all. That will give me all of them. So there we go. There's my list of 5. I've got all 5 on the left-hand side. Just to be clear, we don't actually have to run the 2 separate query selectors. We could actually reduce that down to just one. So I could do document.querySelector all, and then say inside of the left summary element, find all the elements with notification. And that will still give me all 5 on the left-hand side. So that's how we're going to make sure that we get all 5 on the left and all 5 on the right. Okay, so back over here, inside of run comparison, we're going to get all the elements on the left and right. I'll say, how about left side stats? So that's like the statistics being rendered out on the left-hand side. Will be document.querySelector all, and then we want ID left side, what would we call it? Left side, or left summary, my mistake. Dot notification. And then we can do the same thing for right side stats. And that will be document.querySelector all right dash summary dot notification. All right. So now we can loop over either one of these. And at each step, we can take the corresponding element from the other pair, or essentially like the right-hand side, and we can do our comparison by retrieving the data set values. So I'm going to try to iterate over each element inside of left side stats. So I'm going to do a left side stats dot for each. So I'm going to get my callback function right here. I'm going to receive each article element. I will call them left stat. So again, that represents an article element that is going to have that data set value that we really care about. And I'm also going to get the index of that element inside of left side stats as well. The reason I'm getting the index right there is so that I can retrieve the appropriate corresponding stat from right side stats. So I'll say right stat is right side stats at index. And then again, just to make sure we're doing everything correctly here, I'll do a console log of left stat and right stat. Okay, so I'll save, go back over, do the refresh. I'll look for Avengers Dark Knight. And there we go, we've got our console logs. So we can see that each of these console log pairs are the 2 corresponding article elements that go with each other. So like that one and that one. And then the box office, Metascore, IMDb rating, and so on. So then inside of here, we're going to do first get the actual value property off of each of these. So I'm going to say left side value is going to be left stat. And to get a data set property, remember we referred to data set and then the name of that data property on that element. So in our case, we called the data properties value. So we would reference that value property with dataset.value. And then we can get the right-hand side with right side value is right stat.dataset.value as well. So now inside of here, we can do our comparison directly between the two. Again, take note that this comparison process right here, because we assign the stats up front inside of our movie template, we don't care about the order in which these different stats occur. They can occur in any different order. We can have the box office value, then the rating, then the Metascore, or the totally opposite. And it just doesn't matter. All we have to do is make sure that we are iterating through the same properties on both sides at the same time. So in other words, we could not show like first awards over here and then first box office over here. That's the only thing that we could not do. So inside of here, I'll say if right side value is greater than left side value, that means the right side is greater. And that means that we want to add a class to the left-hand side that's going to turn it yellow instead of the default green. So to make sure that we turn the left side yellow, we would run left stat, which remember is the actual article element. I'm going to look at the class list. I'm going to remove the is primary, which is what makes it green. Again, this is some class names coming from Bulma CSS. And then on the left stat class list, I will add in is-warning. And that's what's going to turn it yellow. So now we can repeat the same process for the opposite case as well. So I'll say else write stat class list remove is primary, and write stat class list add is dash warning. All right, so that should be it. So here it is. This is our moment of truth. This should be like the entire application all put together. Let's do our final test. So I will do a refresh. I'm going to look for Avengers. I'll look for Dark Knight. There we go. And all right, that is it. And it's looking pretty good. So we can look through all these different stats, and we should see that the stats that are in green are greater than the ones in yellow. So first off, we've got like 118 wins versus the like 300 and change. So definitely the correct one is green. Well, the Avengers had a higher box office value, so that definitely won out. However, Dark Knight has a better Metascore, better IMDb rating, and more votes as well. So that's pretty much it. That is the whole application. Well, I hope you enjoyed putting this thing together. Let's take a quick pause right here. When we come back in the next video, we're going to do a quick review on some of the important points around this application. All right, my friends, in this video, we're going to do a quick wrap-up of this application. There's just a couple of things I want to point out really quickly that were really important to understand. Bar none, the most important thing about this application was to understand the create autocomplete function. The entire goal here was to create a widget that was entirely reusable in nature. And we saw a little bit earlier how we could very easily swap out a source of data with the fetch data function and the render option function as well to customize what the autocomplete looked like. And that all was done very easily. Think about how we would customize this widget if we didn't have access to this options object. We would have had to go through all the code inside of here and customize each line one by one to change the source of information or change how each option was displayed. So by extracting all this logic into the separate file, you can now take this file right here, add it to any other project that uses the Bulma CSS framework, and ta-da, you've got a working autocomplete. That's pretty much it. The other big thing we learned about was that whenever we wanted to create a reusable widget, it was kind of important to locate all the HTML for that inside the widget itself as opposed to our HTML file. Again, if we had tried to keep our HTML inside of the HTML document around the autocomplete, you and I, for every autocomplete we wanted to show, would have had to put something inside of here of like input, and then a div with a class of dropdown, and then inside there another one with dropdown dash menu and so on. And that would have had to have been done every single time we wanted to show an autocomplete. So we got around that by instead saying, you know what, inside of our HTML document, we're going to show just the absolute minimum, kind of like a placeholder, to display the autocomplete. It was then up to the widget's code to initialize the HTML inside there. And so again, this is what made our widget very reusable, because now we don't really care about what has to be displayed inside of it. We can just say create autocomplete, and the widget is going to set itself up automatically. The last thing we really focused on, well, we focused on a lot, but definitely one of the bigger items, was to really figure out how to run that comparison appropriately. So in this scenario, we realized that trying to pull stats out after the fact from our different movie objects would probably be really challenging, because we would be limited to how often we could reorganize or reorder the different statistics. So instead, inside of our movie template, we decided up front to extract all the relevant values and store those values inside of our DOM. So then we can easily pull those values out later on from the run comparison function by just finding those elements and then referencing the appropriate data set value. Then we could do a very easy comparison without having to worry about what we were actually comparing. Imagine what we would have had to write in here if we were trying to throw in like the entire awards string into each DOM element. We would have had to say something like left side value right here, and then we would have to do some code like if left side value contains awards or something like that. We've had to write some code like that to determine or try to figure out whether or not we were working with the award string. So doing that after the fact would have been really challenging. So instead, we just did all the processing up front, and that made our life down the road way easier. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this application. So let's take a quick pause right here. We still have a ton to learn. We'll continue in the next video.